Nope. Okay, there we go. Looks like my mic is working now. All right. Hello, everyone. Hope you are doing well. So, yesterday we watched a couple videos, a bit fewer than I expected. The first was by Nakey Jakey, and I have it all the way down at the bottom. So, talking about. I don't even know what that is. Let's see. Oh, it's going to be. Anyway, the first one we watched was by Nakey Jakey, just talking about the design of FromSoft in general. And then we watched a couple by Moxie Watts, and then we didn't end up being able to get to Cosmos or Wenders videos. So today we're going to more or less pick up where we left off with Understanding Queen Marica, Elden Ring lore by Cosmos, then Dark Souls lore, Will, Duty, and Suffering by Wenders, and after that, the parallels between Dark Souls and Buddhism by Noxcast, and depending on if we still have enough time, Elden Ring lore, We All Got Bamboozled by Grandsax by Moxie Watts. Alright, so those are the videos I've kind of got queued up for today, and I did finally go back at the backlog of videos you guys wanted me to add to the stream schedule, so they are all included in this now. They're not really in order or anything, so I'll just kind of adjust things on the fly as we go forward. All right, so howdy, welcome into the stream again as always. And you said you didn't say Fear the Old Lore last stream. Typically, I do not say Fear the Old Lore unless I'm making a direct Fear the Old Lore style video, one that's more heavily focused on like a video essay form, or if something is just too nebulous for me to deal with the script writing, the voice work, and all the editing, then occasionally I'll do a Fear the Old Lore stream, but it's not really my main focus, at least for the streaming schedule, so it's just, last Protagonist out. So, non-binary Ava, welcome into the stream. Errant Vice, nice to see you again. Fear not the dark, my friend, and let the stream begin, indeed. You feel like Gwyn is a tragedy and Marica is just a bad person? Oh boy. Always throwing the accusations around about the goodness and badness of Marica and Radigan. It's probably a lot more complicated than we will ever get to know. And there is the meme of Gwyn bad as well. So it's just kind of a FromSoft tradition at this point to have very tragic or flawed antagonists, perhaps. All right. So let's go ahead and dive on into the videos today, starting with Understanding Queen Marica by Cosmos.
The story of Elden Ring expands far beyond the saga of Tarnished that we...
Sorry. My old 2x speed habits. Alright. Hey, Mr. Yadaization. Welcome into the stream. Interesting name there. And El Gusto. Nice to see you again. Yeah, we are doing reacts.
The saga of the Tarnished that we as the player get to experience in-game, as it is but the final act of a forgotten conflict that has shaped the history of the lands between. And at the center of that history lies one key orchestrator, Queen Marica, the Eternal. To understand the story of the lands between means to understand the intent of the one who is its author. Yet how much do we really comprehend of Marica's will? As the vessel of the Elden Ring, Marica is revered as the sole deity within the Golden Order, but in an act steeped in mystery, she shattered the relic, which ignited a catastrophic war and resulted in her confinement within the Earthtree, which culminated in her demise at the hand of the Tarnished, who would become Elden Lord. The question as to why Marica would do such a thing is the impetus to the quest of understanding her character. Some see it as a rebellious act against those who would control her, while others depict her as a torn soul aiming to end the order she initiated, fueled by remorse over its consequences. But I believe that her true motives run much deeper than that. And the answer to this question...
Ooh, that's going to be a spicy topic for a video, talking about the motivations of any character in Elden Ring. That is kind of like my biggest gripe about the story of Elden Ring so far, that we have a lot of factual information about like what happened, but we don't really have very many glimpses into the whys of how they came to be. And you're totally right, Howdy. But anyway, Andrew Hunter, welcome back to the stream. Okay, and Vacuo Zealot. Okay, I think I said hello to you earlier. All right.
Question that I will share with you today will serve as the cornerstone of my interpretation of the hidden story of Elden Ring, what I like to call the emancipation theory. And I guess this is a good time for me to address something. Some of the most direct and commonly asked questions in regard to the lore of Elden Ring are often unanswerable. We, as the player, lack enough information to conclude with certainty many things. In fact, most of the crucial elements that would allow us to paint the full picture are subject to that uncertainty. This is what makes From Software's style of world building so engaging for many of us, but is also the source of much frustration. If we are to ever attempt to move forward towards the greater narrative of the game, we have to accept that some assumptions have to be made. Though we could endlessly list all the various theories and interpretations that surround a certain topic or character, eventually we must take our pick of what makes sense for us, lest we endlessly stick to reading the same item descriptions going nowhere. These channels and my videos are building towards a single grand theory, and as such, this video will be built upon some of my previous works, and taking them for granted. What I try to do is share with you all my perspective and opinion on what I think is the story underneath it all. The goal isn't necessarily to try to infallibly prove why such and such is the right answer, as that would be a fool's errand, but rather lay out all the reasons why I personally think this is the story being told. And I know full well how some of you feel about some of my theories, as they are more on the quote-unquote unique side, to put it nicely. But even still, I do hope you can find value in this scenario I am trying to paint as we move forward. And with that...
So yeah, I can always appreciate these kind of disclaimers, especially for people who aren't as familiar with the lore. It's always nice to be upfront about the infallibility of our perspectives and our own theories. So yeah, kudos to him. And just as like a content creator note, since Cosmos wanted more direct feedback on this stuff, I appreciated the use of the B-roll there. It was not very intrusive and was diverse enough to like keep the attention going. So good job so far. Hey Spencer, nice to see you again. And then... Howdy believes Marica smashed the Elden Ring because she was fearing she'd be replaced by Ranni, not knowing she never wanted to be the vessel for the Elden Ring, so she couldn't have access to the ring. I don't necessarily think she feared Ranni. I mean, of course, like this comes down to individual interpretation and goes back to the whole issue of not really understanding Marica's motives. For me, I think one of the weirder questions is why did Godwin's death specifically trigger the shattering? And there are many, many theories that could plausibly work to explain things, but for me, the one that kind of rings the most true for now is that once she saw that death wasn't fully removed from the order, or that the Erd Tree wasn't necessarily vital to the order like she may have initially thought, that might have been when she decided to scrap everything, but her not wanting Ranni to succeed her is a bit strange, because if that is the case, then why does she tell her demigod children more or less to go to war with each other and become something of themselves? Would I rather have the Golden Order last forever or the Age of Fire last forever? I feel like for the most part they kind of come down to a similar theme mentality-wise, where like they all become essentially hollows, except Dark Souls world is much more unforgiving and the dark is a lot more cannibalistic. So at first I was going to say the Golden Order, but I mean realistically, even if you become a hollow in Dark Souls, at some point you're no longer you and the hollow isn't really human anymore. So there is kind of still an escape from that cycle. So I guess I'm actually going to have to say the Age of Fire, even though I think like Elden Ring's world is has a few more creature comforts than Dark Souls. But that's a very interesting question. Spencer's been playing Ghost of Tsushima. You've really enjoyed it so far? Yeah, that was an interesting game. I think I like did it like halfway through, and then it became a bit too repetitive for me, so I just kind of like paused playing it, and I still haven't picked it back up. But I did like it quite a bit when I was initially playing, at least.
Being said, enjoy. The Golden Order forms the bulk of the history of the lands between as we know it. As the order envisioned by Queen Marica the Eternal, it was created when the Rune of Death was removed from the Elden Ring and sealed away by Marica's shadowbound beast, Marica. an order of life that would produce the Earth Tree. To try to understand Marica's motives, we need to look at the bigger picture. So first, let's start by
So I was thinking about whether or not I should like pause it and address it. So like what Cosmos said isn't necessarily wrong by any means, but it is questionable whether or not the quote unquote sealing of destined death was contemporaneous with the removal of the rune of death from the Elden Ring. So he didn't say anything wrong, but it could lead to some misconceptions, perhaps, that I don't know exactly how Cosmos feels about that topic. So I think I'll just bring it up here for now. It'll probably come back up later, so I'll just, move on forward to the video. Ponyboy, nice to see you again. And Scowleezy, welcome on into the stream.
painting a rough timeline of Marica's reign. Its history began with the war against the Giants, where Marica's army, led by her consort Godfrey, slaughtered the worshippers of the fell god and confined his flame of ruin atop the mountain. Death had already been sealed, and now with the flame of ruin gone, Marica seemingly ensured that nothing could harm the Earth Tree, and then sent...
Okay, so that's interesting that in Cosmos' timeline, he puts the sealing of death, around the war with the Giants, which is perfectly fine. I know many people feel that way. I personally disagree for many reasons that I'll just kind of leave alone for now. But I'll just try to keep this in mind that we have like this inherent disagreement going forward.
Godfrey on a long war to claim the continent. It is also during that period that Radagon made his first appearance in the Liurnian Wars, where he gained renown as a champion and oddly came to marry the enemy's leader, Lunar Queen Renala, ending the war and uniting the houses of the Earth Tree and the Moon. This union, while strategically beneficial, also resulted in the birth of the first Empyrean of the Golden Order, the Lunar Princess Rani. And soon Elden Lord Godfrey subjugated all of the lands, his campaign ending interestingly at the border between Limgrave and Caelid. And after all his enemies were felled, his grace dimmed and he was expelled from the lands between, as Marica calls upon Radagon to be her new consort. The age of Elden Lord Radagon was one marked with many changes to the norms of society, but had also seen the Golden Order enter its golden age, a time that would abruptly come to an end with the first death of a demigod in recorded history. The Night of the Black Knives shook the Empire to its core, as shrouded assassins swept through the lands between, bringing death to the demigods, Marica's children. And finally, after that came the Shattering, where Marica herself shattered the Elden Ring, the trigger for the war that would ensue, where the remaining living demigods fought to claim each other's shard of the Elden Ring. But ultimately they would fail, and leave the lands between ruined and locked in a long stalemate to this day. So, the Two Fingers, arbiters of the greater will's favors, elect to call upon the Tarnished, the graceless warriors that were once banished with Lord Godfrey. They would...
So, Errant Vice asks, do we actually know if Rani was the first Golden Order Empyrean? And with Mikola being one, it's entirely possible Godwin may have also been an Empyrean? Maybe. That's an interesting angle. So, that's a good question. And that also... she's like the first Golden Order Empyrean we know of, like for certain chronologically, but of course, depending on how one feels about Melina potentially being the Glowmide Queen specifically, you could make the argument that she was an Empyrean as well, because the Glowmide Queen is described as an Empyrean, though it is written as hearsay. So yeah. Howdy asked, have I watched the Bandit Games Marica video? Add it to the playlist if not. No, I don't think I've heard of it. If you make a comment on like the actual YouTube video and not on the stream, that way I'll get the notification for it and remember to add it to the list after stream, because while I'm streaming, it's really hard for me to remember like specific names. I'm really bad at remembering names to begin with anyway, so yeah. Depends if Empyreans were a thing before or after Marica became a god. Maybe. Morlor says, so far there's a lot of assumptions asserted as fact. You may have missed the beginning of his video, but he did say that this is more or less like his interpretation of events. So he's kind of already covered his bases on that front. All right, thank you, Howdy.
would extend them grace, and one of them would become Elden Lord. But in order to do so, they would have to burn the Earth Tree itself and free both fire and death, completely destroying the Golden Order. These are in broad strokes the events that lead all the way to the game's endings from the very birth of the Earth Tree. The reason I am laying it all out like this is that it serves to highlight our first and most obvious tell of Marica undermining her own order. The return of the Tarnished after the shattering of the Elden Ring serves as the final nail in the Golden Order's coffin, yet their banishment and subsequent callback was promised by Marica long before any of that would come to pass. And so we can already tell that her reasons for shattering the Elden Ring could not have been on a whim. No, as it is deeply linked to circumstances she herself planned eons before. And as we will see, Marica's involvement in bringing about the events of the game are even more insidious than it initially seemed.
Yeah, and that's one of the other more frustrating things for me to like try to wrap my head around. The whole Megamind plan that Marica may have allegedly had in creating the Tarnished and removing their grace from them so that way they can come back. Obviously, it's very built into the core mythos of the game, but we really have no idea why the hell she planned it. Maybe it was just a countermeasure that she knew she'd need something to happen if Radagon took too much control away from her. So it could have just been her contingency plan from the get-go, but I mean, with so little information about what the role of the god as the vessel is and or what the Elden Lord does with the god, it's just it's got plenty of room for further explanations, we can say. So Jay Bowden's delivery service, thank you so much for the $2 and welcome into the stream. Why can't you kill a demigod with a normal in-game? Get good. I don't know what else to say. It is also interesting that canonically the like plus 25 or like plus 10 special weapons are able to twist time and kill demigods. And I do wonder if that is supposed to be something separate from Destined Death, and or if they're related. Which, I mean, if they were related, that wouldn't be like the craziest thing. Although it would still be kind of crazy, like if Destined Death had some relation to like the Dragon Stone scales or something like that. Why can you kill a demigod with a normal in game? Oh, okay, with a normal weapon. Just probably because it would be too punishing for the players if you didn't fully upgrade the weapon. It's probably more of a game mechanic thing, because I think like you could more or less finish Hugh's quest and he like quote unquote makes the god slaying weapon before you fully upgrade weapons. So those are one of those things where I'll say it's a gameplay concession for the lore. Or I kind of said that backwards, but you get what I'm saying. Errant Vice says, they always figured the Gek Melina thing was sort of like the Ineffable Souls in Dark Souls 2. Like the idea of the Gek finds the host in the Frenzy Flame ending being like Melina. Yeah, and that's another possibility as well. I almost thought about asking this on the Discord the other day, but I think I was distracted and couldn't really like keep up with the conversation if I like initiated it. So this is going to be a bit of a weird thought, and it has nothing to do with the video right now, so I apologize. But do you guys think Shabriri and Hayata ever had their own bodies? Were they ever really people? Or have they kind of always been these weird, malevolent spirits capable of possessing others? Now, obviously, Shabriri did kind of have some control over a body with, like, the nomadic merchants, you know, in more, like, cut content, but I think it still kind of pans out in the final version of the game. So that was just kind of one of the random thoughts that I've had, because what if like Shabriri and or Hayata, maybe Hayata less so, are kind of like the equivalent of outer gods, or like Gowri? I don't know. They're very interesting. Why can't you kill a god with a sword? 'Cause they bleed to death. I don't know, but thank you so much for the 5, the 2, and the 2. I appreciate that. 9 total. Shabriri was a man once. Does the game not explicitly tell us this? So he is a man, but was that version of Shabriri also possessed? Is kind of my question. Spirits can't exist outside bodies, indeed. You think they were once mortal? You guys think Creary was just a dude? You think they'd been people once, and then the possessing people is the power of the frenzy flame? Perhaps. Because it is so sad to me that they didn't flesh out the, I guess that's a pun, flesh out the mechanics of the frenzied flame, like literally burning and getting rid of all which divides and distinguishes with like the nomadic merchants, so they're all kind of all becoming like one person and sharing emotions. Because that'd be a really cool tie-in to like Hayata and or Arena and Shibiri and stuff. You think they had their own bodies at some point? The immortal essence? Maybe. Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff relating to spirit and soul in Elden Ring, which is woefully questionable on the Japanese side of things, that I really don't want to go down that route, because it's a rabbit hole that there's no coming back from. Alright, going back to the video. Ruh-roh, Raggy.
And to show that,
There we
there
go.
is no better place to start than here.
Very well. In Marica's own words, my lord, and thy warriors, I divest each of thee of thy grace. With thine eyes dimmed, ye will be driven from the lands between. Ye will wage war in a land afar, where ye will live and die. Then, after thy death, I will give back what I once claimed, return to the lands between, wage war, and brandish the Elden Ring, grow strong in the face of death. Warriors of my lord, Lord Godfrey.
The Elden Lord armor tells us that when Godfrey's conquest was finished and his last worthy foe was defeated, grace simply faded from his eyes. Him and his warriors, now tarnished, were chased from the lands between. But thanks to the echo of Marica,
So I'm going to back that up a little bit just to... Okay, it's like super slow. Okay. So it was then, as the story is told, that the hue of Godfrey's eyes faded. I have a little bit of a problem in saying that the grace simply faded from his eyes, because we have other descriptions which say that he was robbed of his grace specifically. And so why do I care so much about this pedantic little difference? It's that the grace fading away is a passive thing where it just kind of happens, whereas robbing him of his grace makes it sound as though it was forcefully done, or done like against his will. I mean, doesn't necessarily mean forcefully, although like, very similar ideas there. And so in this description, at the very least, it is written as hearsay. So that's how I can say I don't really believe that his eyes just like faded naturally. And the sword monument over in like the smoldering church borderland between like Limgrave and Caelid is kind of less credible to me as a result of having another item description state bluntly that his grace was robbed. So that's just the way that I look at the lore, and this might not be super significant, but maybe Cosmos will build off a point off of this. So I just wanted to bring it up because it triggered me. Cav, welcome back to the stream. Jay Bowden's delivery service's computer is messed up. Sorry, how come you can kill a god with a normal weapon? Does it make lore sense? Not to you. So, canonically, if you have a fully upgraded, like, plus 25 weapon or a plus 10 special weapon, it should be able to, like, quote-unquote, warp time ever so slightly, or, like, bend time. So that way, you might be able to say that time continues for the demigods and whatnot, and so that way they're able to be killed. And if that is the case, then you could say the Golden Order is imposing a kind of stasis on the lands between, which I think is kind of corroborated in the Golden Poop description, which I'll pull up. And I talk about this description quite a lot for such a kind of seemingly innocuous item. So, gold-tinged excrement says... Gold-tinged excrement is a highly stable substance. It doesn't dry out, nor does it lose its customary warmth or scent. For better or worse, it remains as it is. So to me, this kind of signifies that the gold has a kind of, what's the word, preserving effect. And if the scales of the ancient dragon lord can bend time, that might be able to pierce the kind of stasis that is imposed upon the world by the Golden Order. So that's kind of like my thoughts for that. So as for why like a plus 18 weapon can kill a god, I'll say it's just gameplay mechanics. Vacuous said, you once said the greater will is the collective consciousness of the lands between, but it did send the Elden Ring and has some sentience. It seems to be the arbiter, I think you mean, of life, gold, and order. So I don't necessarily know if it has a conscience, like the whole idea of like sentience, as much as it is just a collective unconsciousness, more specifically. Elder Gusto thinks Marica had a say in expunging the grace. Yes, I agree. Gotta Spaghetti, welcome back. Hope I'm doing well. About to resume the massacre of Old Yarnum while you listen. Nice. This town's finished. Shoot someone with a gun, he simply died. Yeah, the better question is, why do gods get got by bows and arrows, right? Okay, going back to the video.
His last worthy foe was defeated, grace simply faded from his eye. Him and his warriors, now tarnished, were chased from the lands between. But thanks to the echo of Marica, we know that this awfully convenient coincidence was in fact no coincidence at all, but rather, it was Marica's doing. Marica took away their grace, yet for some reason promised them to return it and call them back to their home. In an earlier version of the game, the Tarnished would have gotten a chance to talk directly with Godfrey, which gives us more information around what took place.
Brave Tarnished, mighty warriors who fought at my side, await the summons. It will call to thee one day. Heed the fading grace. Listen to the fingers. Gold commandeth the very stars, giving life its fullest brilliance. Elden Ring, oh Elden Ring. Be ready once it is shattered.
There is a few noteworthy things about this dialogue, but for now what it does is it explicitly confirms to us that Marica intended to shatter the Elden Ring as early as the Age of Godfrey. And the reason couldn't simply have been a change of heart or remorse over the multiple genocide her order was responsible of, since the timing of Godfrey's exile betrays anything but a calculated decision.
So this might be a very contentious claim, but I do think the story did change somewhat because of certain things relating to the Golden Order's quote-unquote conquest of the lands between. I'm trying to remember. Subjugation. Okay, it's the Lowlanders rune, which I think was like a 1.0 item. So the Lowlanders rune says, grace was brought to the very fringes and lowlands of the lands between, and with the Golden Order came the weight of its history, a history of conquest and subjugation. So at the very least, the English uses Golden Order here. The Japanese just uses Gold Tree. So this could have just been a slip up of the translator, just kind of like scanning it and not really paying attention to the characters and just kind of seeing golden and just mentally taking order and overwriting tree here. So the Erd Tree, with the Erd Tree came the weight of its history, a history of conquest and subjugation. So I think in earlier parts of development, the roles between Radigan and Godfrey weren't as well defined, and or the timeline of the shattering in relation to those two characters. And I don't really have like a lot of concrete evidence as to why I think that specifically. So at least in the 1.0 version of the game, there are still some differences in some of the descriptions. So The map for Limgrave East says it's a map of Tenebrai's eastern region. Okay, whatever. We don't know what Tenebrai is, but the domain of Tenebrai, far south of the capital, stands vigil before the vast sea of fog. Radigan's warning is yet told and retold, that one day the Tarnished led into war will cross the sea of fog and return for the Elden Ring. So, to say that they initially expected the shattering to happen at the end of Godfrey's reign does make a lot of sense in some ways because of just how awkward it is for Marica to set up her contingency plan so early compared to the timeline that we have now. But I'm not entirely sure like how much bearing that really has on the final version of the game. So I'm a little bit hesitant and skeptical to just kind of be on board with this right now. Talking to Godfrey would have been awesome. Yeah, for sure.
She first wanted the lands between conquered, and then when she had no more use for him, she sent him away in preparation for events to come. This narrative also serves to raise an essential question. At what point did Marica decide to shatter the Elden Ring? Something that we will have to keep in mind moving forward. So then, what could be the reason that could have made Marica want to betray the Greater Will during that period? Well, the most common motive given by the community for Marica banishing Godfrey was that she came to a realization around this time, and that revelation was what started a change in her that led her to plotting to take down her own order. This event could be summed up as a crisis of fate that swept not only Marica but her subjects too. Though we do not have a definitive timeline of when that happened, we can vaguely link it to the end of the Age of Abundance, which is closely associated with Godfrey's time. The earlier periods of the Golden Order were blessed by the bounty of the Earth Tree. Its sap was collected and was considered the greatest of jewels. But at some point, that fleeting age ended. This change could have heavily harmed the people's faith in Marica, and might have been the cause of great unrest. It is possible that it is also during this period that the Earth Tree seed first appeared. If the existence of the minor Earth Tree Church, as well as the echo of Marica we can hear within it, is linked in any shape or form to those times.
So that's a very, very contentious claim, and I've seen the arguments that Cosmos has gotten into with others, and just like how heated the subject of the Erdtree seeds can be, because I may as well pull up the description. So the Golden Seed says, when the Elden Ring was shattered, these seeds flew from the Erdtree, scattering across the various lands as if life itself knew its end had come. So some people will take this to mean that the Golden Seeds didn't really exist before the shattering, not because of just the way that this description is written, but also because of the Blessed Dew Talisman, which says, it was once thought that the... Wait. No, I'm thinking of which one. Oh, the Cerulean Seeds. Okay. The Erdtree was once perfect and eternal, and thus was it believed that the Erdtree seeds cannot exist in the Crimson and Cerulean Seed Talismans. So, it was believed that the Erdtree seeds could not exist, and when would this have been? These talismans, more specifically, are more directly associated with the Age of Godfrey, because they talk about... Wait, no, that's a lie. It doesn't exactly say when these two came to be, but my headcanon is the Erdtree became perfect and eternal during Radagon's tenure as Elden Lord, and during Godfrey's tenure as Elden Lord, it was still subject to aging and dying and death, and that's where I have a disagreement with Cosmos that the Golden Order, in my estimation, didn't begin until Radagon became Elden Lord, and that was simultaneous to the removal of Destined Death, or the Rune of Death, and we don't really have the info for how or why that exactly happens that way, but that's just kind of where I'm at right now. Isn't this the plot of The Happening? I honestly have no idea. I vaguely remember the title of that movie, but very little is coming to mind. You just got 119 in your Bloodborne 90% personal best for you, but you still feel really bad for having 5,600 hours. You can fully commit to listening to the sweet lore now, though, and relax. Holy crap, that's pretty crazy. I don't really keep track of like speed runs and stuff, but like, what's the world record if you know offhand? Because 119 to me is still really impressive.
Realization that not just the bounty of the Earth Tree but the Earth Tree itself were not eternal was perhaps ample reason for not just the people, but also Marica herself to be shaken. And so the idea would be that in her despair, at the realization that her age would not be eternal, Marica decided to rebel and take the whole of it down with her. However you feel about this explanation, it paints Marica as an incredibly childish character who threw a tantrum of cataclysmic scale.
So this is where I would disagree with Cosmos again, and her crisis of faith here, I think, would coincide very well with her declaration to explore the depths of the Golden Order. And so Cav said that their only disagreement with that is how the Golden Order is so often described as expansionist and aggressive, and Godfrey is the Elden Lord most associated with that expansion and aggression. How would the Golden Order have acquired that reputation under Radagon, who didn't really prosecute any major wars in its name, at least not compared to Radagon? Okay, so maybe I didn't explain my point very well, because it is clear to me, but obviously you guys don't understand Japanese, so sorry. I will break it down a bit more clearly here. So thanks for bringing that back up. So with the Lowlanders rune, grace was brought to the very fringes and lowlands of the lands between, and with the Golden Order came the weight of its history, a history of conquest and subjugation. So the issue is, in the English, it uses Golden Order, which, in my view of the timeline, essentially means Radagon and whatnot. So if you take this alone, yes, I would agree with you that this does seem to be a little bit of a mismatch from the characterization of Radagon, but even before like going fully down that route, I think we can potentially reconcile it with how Muriel says that Radagon, what are the words? Repented his territorial aggressions. So that could potentially work with this reading, but I don't like it for other reasons because I think like the timeline sounds really awkward with this. So the real what's the word? Not incongruity, mismatch. Anyway, the real hang up between this description and the Japanese version is the Japanese version doesn't talk about the Golden Order. It talks about the Golden Tree, which is the Erd Tree. So another way to like translate it would be grace is brought to the very fringes and lowlands of the lands between, and with the Erd Tree came the weight of its history, a history of conquest and subjugation. And I do think that general idea ties into the protection of the Erd Tree incantation, which says, in the beginning, everything was in opposition to the Erd Tree, but through countless victories in war, it became the embodiment of order. So that's just kind of where my head is at on the topic. So I do think Godfrey was more or less the Lord of the Battlefield, as he's called, and he subjugated much of the lands between, but he must have skipped Liurnia or something because they're still around when Radagon's around, and it's a little bit weird. And this could be due to shuffling the timeline or the events of the timeline in development, or maybe the features of the lands between were different before the Shattering or whatnot, or even before Radagon became Elden Lord. The Pangea theory is really popular. There's also the ideas of like Fair Missoula being in the lands between, potentially like connecting the different parts of the lands between. So there are other ways we can describe things here. It's 29 minutes for the world record. That's crazy. You think Marica realized she screwed up by removing death? I don't think she realized she screwed up until Godwin got. You'd think the spreading of the seeds would align with the expansion of the Golden Order's reach and not its collapse. So, right. And so the way that I look at it is with the shattering of the Elden Ring and everything like that, the Erd Tree here became disconnected from its roots, which connect to like the minor Erd Trees and whatnot. And maybe like in a Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball style explosion, the seeds blew out of the Erd Trees. So you have to collect all 7 seeds to summon Placidusax to get your wish of a god-slaying weapon. Aren't there other items that uphold the description of aggression and expansion, or are you misremembering? You'll need to be a little bit more specific, because whatever talks about aggression and expansion isn't necessarily like limited to Godfrey and or Ratigan. I don't think there's enough to inform us of exactly what happened when. The Land of the Lakes fought by Ratigan's order could have been a breakaway state. That's not unheard of in Martin's work. Maybe, but the fact that Muriel calls them territorial aggressions is a bit at odds with the other descriptions where it says like the Erdtree's order essentially came to be due to wars and stuff. So I don't think there was like a civil war where the Carians broke free from the Erdtree, because they held their own against their soldiers. Mr. Yadaization says, they've wondered why Gideon comments on the Queen's sorrow when you tell him about Mikola. Kind of makes it seem that Godwin being killed wasn't a total L until Mikola was kidnapped. Yeah, that's a very strange quote. And I guess we kind of have to take our own L trying to figure out what the hell's going on.
Upon finding out that her order was not eternal, she decided to plan eons in advance its elaborate downfall, at the cost of the land, her children's life, and her own. For make no mistake, Marica's actions to shatter the ring come at her own detriment. As the vessel, Marica would shatter with the Elden Ring, a fact she was fully aware of, and the ultimate goal of the Round Table Hold and the Tarnished, as per her own instructions, is the murder of a god, herself.
Are you having second thoughts? Might I have a word, then? You're kinda meant to challenge them. To slay them. Now wield it. And kill them. They're demigods and their god. Queen Marica herself wishes it so.
Hugh was always saying that you were a lord to him. So slay her with the weapons he smithed. Slay the god Marica, who cursed us all.
The brightest days of the Golden Order were yet still ahead, and she had just united the lands between, fully establishing her rule. This is the equivalent of building a new house, and just as work on it is done, you realize that it will fall apart in the next 50 years. And so you take it upon yourself to plan decades in advance to burn it down and everyone inside. As flawed as a character Marica may have been, this course of action just doesn't add up if those are her motivations. Even more than that, I don't believe that the end of the Age of Abundance led to Godfrey's banishment, nor do I think Marica was upset about it. Instead, I want to suggest that both Godfrey's exile and the end of the Erdtree's bounty happened for the same underlying reasons, with the former potentially happening first. Let me explain. You see, the Erdtree was born and grew from the red primal matter of the Crucible. The Crucible once...
And I would strongly disagree with this, and this is a very terrible translation of the Gilded Great Shield. So the issue here is it talks about the red tinge in the gold court mirrors the primordial matter that became the Erdtree, the color of homeward yearning. That's not really what the Japanese says. And when you say that something was primordial matter that became the Erdtree, it makes it sound like a primordial soup that like later got integrated into the Erdtree. So let's pull up the Gilded Great Shield. So, right. So the red color is, this is such a pain in the ass to like translate, is like, what's the word? It possesses a red tint that is close to the origin beginning of the Erdtree. So, to repeat that, the coating of the shield possesses a red flavor that is close to the origins of the Erdtree, that is very different from the primordial matter that became the Erdtree. And then, of course, it is the color of homeward yearning, and then like this would be like the color of like reminiscence, nostalgia, might be a good way to say it. Like homeward yearning is really good, and I think that's kind of like meant to like tie into like some stuff relating to like Dark Souls and whatnot. But anyway, The reason why this one bothers me the most is because it definitely makes the Crucible sound completely different from the Erdtree, whereas I would make the argument, due to the Japanese text of multiple items, most specifically the Crucible Knight set, that the Crucible was the Erdtree, although it is more likely Godfrey's Erdtree specifically. And I know that will really rub a lot of people the wrong way, because the idea of like the primordial matter, the primordial ooze from which all life came, is very appealing. And I thought similarly for months when I was, first looking into the lore. But after like I looked at like everything and I was like, wait a second, this says that the Crucible is the Erdtree, not necessarily like the primordial form. The whole like primordial form thing is another like product of localization. So why does that matter? I would need to think about like what his context was. Let me read chat. You wonder if Marica still would have shattered the ring if a different demigod had been killed? That's a very interesting question. I would think so, because I think once Godwyn dies and Deathroot takes form, it hijacks things returning to the Erdtree. And so once souls and whatnot stop going back to the Erdtree, yet the order still stands, I think Marica realizes that her order was kind of usurped from her right under her nose, and she didn't even realize until Godwyn died. But of course that might be contingent on like Deathroot being a thing. In a world where reincarnation exists, true oblivion is terrifying. At least the frenzy flame burns all souls together. How many mistranslations are there in the English version of Elden Ring? There appear to be quite a few. So this is the case of a very prominent like Japanese saying where the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. So because of the nature of like my work and relaying these differences of translation to you guys, it makes it sound like they're more numerous than they really are. So there's a lot that goes into that. So for one thing, like the translators might not be given enough time and or context to truly figure out what the devs mean. And so they kind of are obligated to make decisions which stray from the intended meaning of the text at times. And there could be a number of reasons for that, because there could be some like ambiguous things in the text, or just like writing things one way in English kind of inadvertently closes off other interpretations that are still viable in Japanese. It's just the nature of like the beast that you can't directly translate everything and have it like retain all of its meaning. So aside from that, there are also the issues of script changes, localization changes, and the time that it takes to update those back into the game. So sometimes, like, I know, like, for Bloodborne specifically, the English text of the game and the Korean text of the game were given a version of the text, and so those kind of made it to the final build of the game. But after the English and Korean were finalized, the Japanese most likely received a revision, and those revisions weren't sent back to the English and Korean translators. So how could you make a proper translation of the text if you're not given the final version of the text to begin with? So there's a lot of different ways where things can kind of go sideways. But generally speaking, a lot of what Frog Nation does is really respectable, especially in terms of keeping people immersed in the kind of fantasy settings that are available in these games. They do have some brilliant localizations at times. Like one of my favorites is calling the moon presence in Bloodborne the moon presence, as opposed to something like the being or monster of the moon. Because when it's like laid out that directly, you're like, oh, okay, I know what to expect. But the moon presence is so vague that it kind of doesn't really mean anything up until you experience it for yourself. So ironically, by making the text more vague, they made it more compelling in its overall presentation of the game. So anyway, when Godfrey is referred to as the patriarch of the golden lineage, what does that use of the golden line up with golden order in the Japanese text? So yes and no. The issue is gold doesn't necessarily imply golden order, as evidenced by like primordial gold, like the more red tinged gold and things like that, and vice versa. So while he is called like the golden lineage, that doesn't necessarily mean golden order lineage, if that makes sense. So that is a strong possibility that I do not rule out myself. But up until the point that I have absolute confirmation that the Golden Order really begins with Godfrey, I'm going to remain on the fence. And the more that I've like stayed on the fence about this position, like the more details I'm seeing to suggest that Destined Death and whatnot wasn't removed until like after the Age of Abundance. Tyler, welcome back to the stream. Let's not forget anytime soon the life rune curses. Maybe. Okay, going back to the video.
Contain the origin of all life blended together within it, and the earth tree feeds on the corpses of those who would latch onto its roots as part of the traditional burying rite of the Golden Order. Miquella also later tried to recreate an earth tree by watering one of its seeds with his own blood. All of this to say that the earth tree and its offsprings feed on concentrated life energy, in this case, people or blood. Then, Godfrey's campaign through...
And that's one of my favorite things about like Miquella's lore in general, and that might also be why the Halig tree failed to become an Erd tree, because blood doesn't contain like the full life essence of people, which I might need to think about that a bit more directly now that I think about this now, because if gold and will is in blood, and blood is used to water the Halig tree, but it's not enough to make it into an Erd tree, I guess that does still just show like the separation between will and spirit, which is more or less what I thought. Anyway.
Throughout the lands between and the countless death it's created, must have watered the land and fed the earth tree, allowing it to grow to its full glory. And it was the abundance of corpses that was behind its abundance of blessings. This mechanism was reflected in the very culture of the Golden Order, particularly during Godfrey's age. Even putting aside the obvious act of earth tree burial, the arenas which were built all around the lands between were sites where bloody ritual combat to the death was conducted in honor of the earth tree, another practice that also later died in the Age of Radagon. And so it wasn't a coincidence that the bounty of the earth tree was only associated with...
I'm gonna need to think about this a bit more. Not like what Cosmos just said, but the idea of there being like the giant jar outside the Colosseum, does that necessarily connect the Jarman to the Age of Godfrey? And so was Erdtree burial a thing during his time? I could see that. So part of the reason why this is tripping me up a little bit is because I've wondered for a very long time when exactly the act of Erdtree burial started and or when it was no longer effective. And I've wondered, no real like conclusive thoughts about this. I've wondered whether or not Erdtree burial kind of stopped working during Radigan's time, but I guess that wouldn't really matter if like if like Deathroot infiltrated the roots of the tree. I guess that would still imply that the souls must have been going back there. Or maybe not. I don't know. I would need to think about that a bit more.
Death was conducted in honor of the earth tree, another practice that also later died in the Age of Radagon. And so it wasn't a coincidence that the bounty of the earth tree was only associated with Godfrey's age, but rather it was that age of bloodshed that was behind it in the first place. And to further add on to what I said earlier, I would like to address the main reason behind the idea that Marica despaired around this period of time, that being the echo found in the minor Earthtree Church.
In Marica's own words, I declare mine intent to search the depths of the Golden Order through understanding of the proper way. Our faith, our grace is increased. Those blissful early days of blind belief are long past. My comrades, why must ye falter?
Marica never in any situation has addressed anyone with anything but absolute authority, be it Godfrey, Radagon, or her children the demigods. She naturally stands above all of them. Her power was never hinging on the faith or acceptance of her subjects. Yet somehow in this echo, she is addressing her audience as comrades and is arguing, trying to convince them that things will be fine, trying to sell them on this new path ahead, trying to quell their unrest. I believe this is not Marica talking. Let's take a moment to look a bit closer at this echo. What Marica talks about in her speech could only be described as the impetus, the rationale behind Golden Order fundamentalism.
There we go. The real unique theory presented here. So yeah, this is something that I've heard before. Maybe it originated from Cosmos, but yeah. I don't really have very strong feelings on whether or not Radigan is speaking as Marica in this echo, because I could see ideas to support that as well as ideas that would go against that, just because the fact that Marica talks to Radigan kind of suggests that they didn't necessarily like fight over control. Oh man, how do I say this? The fact that Marica can still talk to Radigan may suggest that the two still retained some individuality, and it's not as though like Marica was completely supplanted by Radigan. I don't know how to articulate that a bit better right now. Aaron Device said, did the Halig tree fail because Miquella's blood wasn't enough? Or was it because Millennia was rotting it and it was from Moog absconding with Miquella while he was cooking? Or some combination of the three? And then I replied in the chat, yes, lol, because we don't really know exactly why the Halig tree failed. There is the potential that the Halig tree could have never grown up because it suffered from a similar curse as Miquella of like eternal youth. So if that's the case, like obviously the size and scope of the Halig tree makes it seem much more than a sapling, but in terms of like gigantic magical trees, maybe it was the equivalent of a sapling. Who's to say?
Fundamentalism is a religious movement that appeared at some point during the Golden Order. It aims to study and understand order in its most pure form. It is said to be scholarship in all but name, and for good reason. The study of order is more akin to scientific research in our world than religion. And fundamentalism seems to be taking inspiration from the real-world scientific fervor of the Islamic Golden Age, where the principles of ijtihad championed independent reasoning and critical analysis. This period was marked by a profound commitment to scientific exploration. The pursuit of knowledge was deemed a religious duty, inspired by the Islamic belief that understanding the natural world was a means of gaining a deeper appreciation for God's creation. This is why Golden Order fundamentalism focuses on mathematics and physics, as they are means by which one can model and understand the universe. This scientific dimension also explains why their incantations are based on intelligence as much as fate. The existence of fundamentalism and its nature also serve to inform us on where Elden Ring takes its inspiration for the concepts of chaos and order, and that is a topic I am very excited to explore in a future video. In a way, what it does is bridge the gap between sorceries and incantations, and so to be a fundamentalist, one would require both the academic rigor and drive to unearth the secrets of nature, as well as being a greatly devout and godly person. Enters Radagon, the second Elden Lord, a character who in his quest for self-fulfillment, for completion, sought to study and understand many things. As the husband of the Lunar Queen, he studied sorceries, and as the husband of Marica, he studied incantations. From Radagon's Ring of Light, we know that he was a fundamentalist. But more so than that, it is abundantly clear that there is no better candidate to be the founder of the movement than him. As seen from the Echo of Marica, fundamentalism's impetus started around the time where the people of the Golden Order faced a crisis of fate, which happened due to the end of the Age of Plenty associated with Godfrey. Radagon, as the new Elden Lord, brought into the Golden Order the sorceries and culture of Caria, and into the Fate he brought the methods he used during his studies of the stars. And so Golden Order fundamentalism was born, marking both a change in the faith and the norm of the age. The minor earthly church is deeply linked to that transition, and it is also there that we find the seal that enhances Golden Order fundamentalist incantations. Marica, on the other hand, is never associated with fundamentalism. The person who was pleading to the people and preaching what is essentially fundamentalism is not Marica, it is Radagon. And it is when we consider that for a moment that the tone of the speaker starts to make a lot more sense. Radagon was at one point a common soldier of the Golden Order, who through his achievements in war, rose to the rank of champion and finally Elden Lord.
So I do wonder whether or not Cosmos believes Radagon to have been his own individual person who later merged with Marica. That might be what he's building towards here. But I was going to say, I think it might also be relevant to consider how the two came to be one. Well, maybe not like literally, or why Marica felt the need for Radagon to conquer Liurnia to begin with. Because I think although like Radagon is obviously his own person to some degree, I mean, I don't think he could have truly come to be without the approval of Marica somehow. It's nice to see the Islamic Enlightenment get an actual mention in an Elden Ring video. Yeah, what can I say? Here in the West, we get that very, very glossed over in our history courses, if it's even taught at all, which it's probably not mentioned in like public high school. So it's probably like more of a university type thing or extracurricular, maybe not extracurricular, but like, what's the word? Not like mainstream classes. I can't think of what they're called. With that, Horns, welcome on in. Okay.
Radagon would address his contemporaries in the manner seen in this dialogue. This piece of dialogue is pivotal to understanding Marica's character, and me taking it away from her has a significant impact on how her motivations can be interpreted. The reason I am saying all of that is that I want you to understand that I am not doing it lightly. The game through Melina explicitly spells out that this is an echo of Marica, and I do not make a habit of randomly discrediting or dismissing what the game or a character is telling us. Though many...
Nah, you should do that whenever you want. The characters are all unreliable. I mean, obviously, I'm probably one of like the worst culprits of doubting what the characters say. So it's probably a little bit ironic that I'm fine with saying like, "Oh no, I don't think that's Radagon right there," just because I am very skeptical of what the characters know. So to give a little bit more context behind that, what I mean by that is, throughout the FromSoft games, there is a very strong trend of characters having preconceived notions about their worlds and realities that aren't necessarily congruent with those worlds and realities. So, what's a good example of somebody being confused? Oh, like Corrin and Gold Mask. Like, Corrin doesn't understand what's going on. He's led to believe that Marica is one specific thing, and then once Gold Mask figures out the truth, like, Corrin can't handle it. That's just one example. There's maybe the False Josefka isn't the best example, but Gilbert, at least in Bloodborne, thinks that he will die human. Spoiler alert, he doesn't. So there's like a lot of ways that the games are not entirely inconsistent from the point of view of the game itself, but the fact that the characters don't have that full understanding of the world is a common theme in these games, and we could look to characters like Sage Frake, perhaps, as like one of the bastions of like that archetype that they moved forward with. Without Horn says, even with 300 level philosophy classes, there's like one paragraph about the Islamic Enlightenment. It's, yeah, not wrong. What you've heard, Japanese primary history education is also surprisingly Eurocentric. I mean, yes and no, and part of that could be because, after the war, the U.S. really wanted to re-socialize the Japanese so that they were a less warlike people, to say things maybe a bit more tastefully. But even still, like, there's a surprising amount that is not covered in Japanese history. Like, a lot of Japanese people don't understand exactly what the Nazis were, and a lot of Japanese people are either ignorant or willfully ignorant of the war crimes that Japan committed over the course of the war. You just talked to who about that, Spaghetti? Am I psychic? No, I wish. You didn't learn much about the Islamic Golden Age even in college, so you had to learn more about it online. Yeah, I only have like a very cursory understanding of it because, I mean, I've just been very interested in many things over the years. So like I know like a lot of our advancements in like math and science were predicated on the Islamic Golden Age. Like that's why we use quote unquote Arabic numerals. It's really funny when you try to fearmonger people into banning Arabic, like teaching children Arabic numerals in school. But anyway, oh, you're talking to Gilbert? Okay. All right, going back to the video.
Will vehemently disagree with this take, and that's understandable. In this case specifically, I believe there is room for an argument to be made. Based on what we as the player know, the notion that this dialogue is actually from Radagon is not inconceivable, as the game also explicitly tells us that Radagon is Marica. And what is conceivable becomes likely to me when considering the context in which the echo lies, its contents, and how it fits into the bigger narrative of Marica's actions and her motivations. And so to summarize, not only can Marica's course of action not be justified by a crisis of fate, the main clue of such an event might be a massive misdirection and not her words at all, and the presumed trigger, the end of the Age of Abundance, likely took place during a transitional period following Godfrey's banishment, in a time where Radagon was just beginning his reign as Elden Lord. And so by saying that, we are back to square one. Which means, to better understand Marica's intentions, we must turn our attention to what may be the most pivotal event in the history of the Golden Order.
So Phaelad asks, is there any more information or clarity around the text on the protection of the Erd Tree? Quote, in the beginning, everything was in opposition to the Erd Tree, end quote. So sort of, but not really. Depending on how you read items relating to the war against the fire giants, you can make the connection between the two, that at the beginning of the Age of the Erd Tree, there was also the war with the giants. So yes, but there is nothing ever really explicit, and that's just kind of part and parcel of how FromSoft builds the storytelling of their world. Right.
The misshapen corpse on the Stormveil. That is a sacred relic of the Black Knives plot, as that famed night of assassination is known. It happened during the golden age of the Erd Tree, long before the shattering of the Elden Ring. Someone stole a fragment of the Rune of Death from Malekith, the Black Blade, and on a bitter night murdered Godwyn the Golden. That was the first recorded death of a demigod in all history. You recall our conversation about the Night of the Black Knives, yes? They say the assassins who carried out the deed were scions of the Eternal City, a group entirely of women arrayed in armor of silver under cloaks which fooled the eye. The knives they wielded, though, were imparted with the power of the Rune of Death through sinister rite.
So even if we were to concede that Marica's actions weren't due to a change of heart that happened sometimes after the early days of her reign, it could be said that her preparation for the returns of the Tarnished and the shattering of the Elden Ring could have been some sort of insurance or backup plan, a sort of big red button to press if she ever felt like it. And so the trigger in this situation would have been the assassination of her children during the Night of the Black Knives, as it is called, the event that took the beloved Godwyn the Golden from the lands between. Even in universe, there is a notion that it is the Knight of Knife that drove Marica to the brink. It is important to remember though that very few people are actually aware that Marica shattered the Elden Ring. Specifically, only the Fingers and those who received their guidance like Gideon and other Tarnished who have procured a great rune, and probably the demigods. It seems the masses think that Marica has simply abandoned them. So the general perception is that the Knight of Knives, the smashing of the Elden Ring, and the Shattering War were all part of the same cascade of events. But the notion that Marica shattered the ring due to her children's death is actually the players putting two and two together. But as we will see, looking at everything we know and the relationships of the different people involved, it is in fact more likely that Marica had a direct hand in orchestrating that event. Rani the Witch, daughter of Radagon and Renala, was the individual behind the forging of the God-slain Black Knives. After stealing a fragment of the Rune of Death from Manicat, she enacted a specific ritual which resulted in the simultaneous death of Godwyn's soul and her Empyrean flesh. The Black Knife assassins, her accomplices, rode through the lands between that night and killed multiple of Marica's children. And those same assassins are also said to be Numen women from the Eternal Cities, and they constitute our first and most obvious link to Marica. As Numen, they are of the same race as her, and their armor even says that they share close ties. The nature of their relationship is never elaborated on, though it could be tempting to jump on this link to incriminate Marica's involvement in that plot. This piece of information does not tell us either ways if they were working for Marica or were opposed to her and enacting some sort of vengeance.
I think Cosmos needs to turn the RTX off. The frame rate is a little bit rough right there.
It might be worth pointing out that Melina, Marica's daughter, actually shares the assassin's fighting style. What you might deduce from that is up to how meaningful you think that actually is. What actually matters here is Melina herself, who is one of the few confirmed direct accomplices of Marica's design. She is the Kindling Maiden and serves as a guide to aid the Tarnished in his mission of becoming Elden Lord. Melina's role was directly given to her by her mother, and that role includes burning the Earth's Thorn and entrusting the player with certain keepsakes, notably Torrent, the Spirit Steed, and the Crimson and Cerulean Flasks. Where this comes full circle is that when entrusted with Torrent, the player will be confronted by none other than Rani, the main culprit behind the Knight of Knives. Rani says that she has been tasked with delivering you something at the request of Torrent's former master. This is vital as
That's kind of a good point right there, that there is a potential through line, depending on how close you want to think that Marica is to Melina, and Torrent's relation through Marica, then Melina, and then Rani for orchestrating her plot. But if that were the case, it is kind of curious that Rani isn't a bit more forceful with her invitation to the Tarnished. I don't know, maybe it's forceful enough. I don't know. I guess I just need to think about that a bit more.
As the delivery of certain items to a chosen Tarnished is a known part of Marica's plot, something that she directly instructed her daughter to do. Rani, by aiding in that process and wishing us good luck in our quest, shows herself to be directly in the know of Marica's plan. And by the way, should you miss the meeting with Rani, the items will find their way directly to the Round Table Hold. This, in combination with the close ties the Black Knife assassins have with Marica, makes her connection to the Knight of Knives significantly more likely.
Is that a lore thing, or is that something that I think they may have like patched in later? I don't know. Maybe I need to like double check on like 1.0, because there's a lot of stuff like that, like quest stuff, that they made a bit more streamlined with the additional patches to the game.
But that would mean that Marica wanted her children killed then. And the answer is yes. For make no mistake, the God of the Golden Order has no qualm sacrificing her own children for her goals. And the first instance of that is simply Melina, which serves as nothing more than kindling in her mother's design. And even when considering the soulless demigods themselves, there is only one instance in-game which gives us any sort of hint as to how Marica sees them or feels about them. The ghost of the Mausoleum Church of the Weeping Peninsula laments the state of the soulless demigods, describing them as the Queen's unwanted children. This cold detachment between the demigods and their god is also most notably visible in an echo of Marica where she addresses them directly.
Hear me, demigods. My children, beloved, make of thyselves that which ye desire. Be it a lord, be it a god, but should ye fail to become aught at all, ye will be forsaken, amounting only to sacrifices.
If you ever had any doubts that Marica would be willing to sacrifice her beloved children, then this would make it clear how far she would go. This echo is particularly interesting as it shows the truth behind the Shattering War. The demigods were in a way accused of being corrupted by the strength of the Great Runes and driven by ambition they warred. Though this could still be true for some of them, for example Godric, the reality of the situation is that they were given no choice by Marica. They would either slaughter each other or die at the hand of the common tarnished. And if you still feel that they somehow had any sort of agency over the outcome of the situation they were put in, then hold on that thought for a bit longer, until we expose the full dreadful truth of Marica's control in the last part of this video. And this manipulation.
So Cal0 said, theory, Ronnie screwed up Marica's plans by carving the other half of the Ring of Death and killing herself at the same time as Godwin. So it's difficult to talk about because it's unclear if Ronnie becoming bodiless was intended on her part, or if she was just like collateral damage in the murder of Godwin. Even like the cutscenes and opening like cinematic like pictures don't really show Ronnie next to Godwin, which is really frustrating. So to me, like, it does make me question the quote unquote canonicity of the trailers and whatnot. But at the very least, Ronnie didn't have all of the Rune of Death because she only stole a fragment of it from Malekith. So it could have just been like the equivalent of a firearm misfiring due to a round that failed to be ejected from its chamber. So to say that to people who are less familiar with like weapons and whatnot, if you have a gun and you shoot it, normally the bullet will eject out of the gun, while the casing of the bullet will eject out of the gun, and then the next bullet from the magazine or clip or whatever will be fed into the chamber where you can fire again. But if that first casing was still there, and then you go to fire a second round with it not being fully aligned into the chamber, and like the firing pin of the primer goes off and the bullet tries to fire, but there's an obstruction in the way, it can explode in front of your face and cause a lot of collateral damage. That may have been something similar in principle to what happened with Ronnie's murdering of Godwin. So there's just always so many unanswered questions. And it's also questionable, like, why Godwin specifically? Was there a bigger reason for that? Was Godwin trying to stop Ronnie from killing herself to be freed of the two fingers and he became collateral damage? Was Godwin the Golden like the biggest military target for Ronnie for whatever reason to establish her own order? Maybe. There's a lot of possibilities on the table. Next cartridge. It's all good. Okay, going back to the video.
Manipulation wasn't just reserved to the demigods either, as it extended also to her own shadowbound beast. As an Empyrean, Marica was given Malekith as a loyal servant, but also as an insurance for the fingers, as Malekith would turn into a baleful shadow to kill her had she gone astray. However, Marica's only use she had of Malekith was as a guardian of destined death, sealed very far away from her and her order. But even then, she betrayed him.
Marica, why wouldst thou gull me? Why? Shit.
Malekith believes that Marica fooled him, yet the only thing she had him do dates back to the very creation of the Golden Order. If that act by itself constitutes a betrayal, then it means it was done with ill intent, that being the taking of the finger's insurance out of the picture. And so it seems that even then, from the very beginning, Marica's actions show that she always intended to betray the Greater Will and his emissaries. Now, this is a lot to take in and consider, and perhaps even if you had indulged me so far, all I have been doing is taking away potential reasons for Marica to want to shatter the Elden Ring. So the question still stands then, why? And I promise I will get to that in just a moment. But the reason I have been so insistent on the question of when did Marica decide to do it is that the answer to that serves as our biggest lead on understanding Marica's motivation. The understanding that Marica's actions were not in fact reactionary and not a consequence of something that happened during the Golden Order is the point that I'm trying to drive home. And from there, we don't have to look very far to understand the why. Rani, as well as the Black Knife Assassins, are what informs us on Marica's true alignment. You see, Rani's end goal is to bring about the Age of the Stars, where she takes the Elden Ring, Order itself, and embarks on a grand journey throughout the Dark Cosmos, as to take its influence away. This also happens to be the goal of the Nox and the Eternal Cities, from which the Black Knife Assassins hail. The Nox are said to be an ancient race who were once punished by the Greater Will for opposing it, and were consequently buried underground. Ever since, they have been plotting, wishing, and preparing for what they call the Age of the Stars. From the Black Knife Assassins, we know that the Nox are related to the ancient Numens, the same race as Marica. And as it turns out, Marica the Eternal's connection to the Eternal cities goes a lot deeper than just her title. In fact, she could potentially be its founder.
And that's an idea I've had as well, but even though I've had that idea, a lot of me doesn't like that because it makes it really awkward in my mind that with the Eternal Cities, understanding of sorcery and the night and stuff, why would Marica need to study at Rayo Lucaria as Radigan? One potential explanation could be that she needed lunar sorcery specifically from Renala, and that could have, influenced things, but nonetheless, we don't really have a lot of signs of the Erdtree faithful using sorceries to any degree. Though to be fair, there are the Erdtree burial watchdogs, which have glintstones embedded in their staffs, their staves. The staff of the crozier. No, that's a different one. Anyway, they use glintstone, and that's weird. So anyway, going back to chat, El Gusto said Godwin was the favorite. It hurt Marica the most. Well, that also is contingent upon whether or how much you believe Marica had a role in the Night of the Black Knives and the orchestration of the plot, I guess. Cal Zero said, killing his soul was definitely intentional, but you're not convinced the death route and subsequent spread and corruption was part of the plan. True. Ronnie says, in English, I stole the rune of death, slew mine own Empyrean flesh, casting it away. That sounds very intentional to you. Is it more ambiguous in the Japanese? So this isn't really an issue of Japanese or English, but there is enough ambiguity and enough guardedness by Ronnie where I take what she says as a very factual statement of events. So she took the rune of death and she slew her body, but that doesn't say anything about her intentions in doing so. Obviously, later on, we can piece together that she wanted to be rid of the Two Fingers control. So she might have wanted to do that. And if so, it still brings up the question of what was Godwin's role in that? Was he trying to stop Ronnie from breaking free of the Two Fingers? I think that's very plausible, and he could have been collateral damage. But did Ronnie wish for oblivion, or did she wish for her own order? We don't really know that much either, do we? It feels like Marica and Ronnie colluded with each other, and that is also a very strong possibility. Ronnie's quote always sounded like sarcasm to me, but it could just be the performance. Yes. And so I do think it is important to remember when Ronnie is telling us that, there are a couple possibilities for her to phrase it to us. Whether or not you've already become a member of her faction, and whether or not you've met her, and whether or not you've talked to Roger to plot against her. Not against her, but plot behind her back. So she is a bit more guarded if you've talked to Roger beforehand, but yeah, I don't really know exactly how to take her lines because the whole circumstances behind the Night of the Black Knives are shrouded in mystery. Obviously, maybe not obviously, I am more partial to believing that Marica had a role in everything, but it is questionable how much of a role she had. El Gusto says, that's cope. Metaphysically speaking, it makes sense. You need one to lose their souls while another loses their body. Ronnie wanted to lose her body to gain freedom. I would disagree because there's also the possibility that she could have conspired with Rykard and, what's his face? Radon to halt the stars so that way she could kill her body, but her soul would still live on. So there's multiple ways that it can be read. So I don't necessarily think it's cope. Valad says, in order to use the Rune of Death, something needs to die in body and spirit, so the only way to be free would be to offer a separate body and spirit. She used Godwin as a sacrifice. And that's a possibility as well, but it's curious why Godwin specifically and how, like, the circumstances of how that came to be. Without Horns says, they always read it like Godwin was just happened to be the best person for the other half of Ronnie's ritual, rather than being targeted for another reason. And so to like expand on that a little bit further, that could be a strong possibility because the Lunar Princess Ronnie is associated with the Dark Moon, and Godwin is associated with the Sun and or the eclipse. And so how do you make an eclipse? You put a dark moon in front of the sun. Or like when the sun is behind the moon still like looks black, and that might have been meant to have been intentional on the developer's part.
If you have watched my video on Radagon being a mimic of Marica, you would know that one of the pillars of that theory is that Marica hails from the Eternal City, the same civilization that tried to create a lore through mimicry. Back then, the main connection I was aware that led credence to that idea were the Black Knife Assassins, as well as the internal names for the Eternal City enemies. But since then, a few more things came to my attention. Even though the Nox enemies were named Marica lineage in the files, the item description of the Nox sorceress and priestess Ash in the 1.0 version of the game clarifies their genealogical link much more explicitly. The Nox are said to be the descendants of Marica, to which they owe their title of Empyrean's family, found in the 1.0 Nox armor set. This is where I would like to remind you of what the potential link of the Black Knife Assassins to Marica might be, and the fact that Melina, Marica's daughter, shares their distinct fighting styles. But perhaps the most exciting discovery made on the subject comes from YouTuber and data miner Sekiro2b, who in a Twitter post enabled internal flags the developer over at From Software used while working on the game areas. These flags are obviously not meant to be seen by the player, and what they give away is the labels by which the devs internally refer to the Eternal Cities, calling them Marica Ruins. This insight into Marica's potential origins also begs the question of how old is she really, and what if the Eternal Cities were explicitly named after her? But I will leave those questions for another time. Even though cut content spells it out for us, there is still ways to infer the Marica Eternal City connection from what we have in-game, though it takes a lot more speculation. Black Knife Assassins aside, for example, you will notice that the Vulcan mausoleums that cradle Marica's dead offspring, the soulless demigods, are actually Eternal City structures, which is fairly significant as one's burial rite usually speaks volumes about their heritage, even if it wasn't clearly apparent in life. Then there is a lot of small details like the Earthree's culture taking a lot from the alchemical practices of the Eternal Cities, with chemists being priests of the Earthree, as well as perfuming being as common of a practice as it is. Even the architecture of Leyndell takes some distinct patterns from the Eternal Cities, while Lower Leyndell is completely in the same architectural style as Ordina and Celia, which are basically the closest things to surface settlements for the Nox. Have you ever wondered why Godfrey's conquest of the lands between stopped at the border between Caelid and Limgrave? It's an odd stopping point for a war that did not leave an inch of the lands unturned. Caelid is a region controlled by Celia, the town of sorcery, where Radahn would later learn gravitational magic. It has also clear ties to the Eternal Cities, and even Sage Gowry, referring to them as descendants of the Eternal.
You've been a saint through and through. As thanks, I vow to impart to you my knowledge of the lost sorceries of the Celians, descendants of the Eternal.
I don't see any reason why the Golden Order's conquest would ever stop at the last region left to grab, unless said region was already considered annexed territory, and Celia is unquestionably part of the Golden Order today. And so perhaps this is the most important point I would like to communicate with this video. something as major as the current god and vessel of the Elden Ring being also of the Eternal Cities, which are directly and openly opposed to the Fingers and the Greater Will, is not something that can just be ignored. In order to even start discussing what Marica's character is like and what her motivation are, you need to acknowledge and take into account her origins, which is perhaps one of the most commonly overlooked aspects of any analysis of her I have ever seen, particularly in this case where said origins come with such a heavy baggage. The notion that Marica could be working to destroy her own order from the inside since the very beginning only seems so outlandish when you don't account for who she was before being a god.
And I think these are all very fair questions to ask. Let me read the chat real quick. Maybe Godwin stood for the status quo and Marica and Ronnie were looking for something new. Marica and Ronnie just didn't see eye to eye on this something new. It's very unclear. Part of the reason why I don't like the idea of Radigan being a mimic tier or a lord of the Nox and whatnot is because it uses the same terminology of like Lord of the Night that is used to describe Ronnie's consort as Lord of the Night. So if they use something else, I could be like more for the theory that like the Nox essentially usurped things away from Marica. But it feels like there's a lot of hoops you need to go through to justify Radigan being a mimic tier, yet Marica was also the eternal of the Eternal Cities, which I don't think is entirely impossible, but it's just the where and whens on the timeline are very frustrating to make out, especially when we consider that if Celia was already annexed territory under the forces of Godfrey and Marica combined, then why was there such an antagonism between the Golden Order forces, the Erdtree forces, and Raya Lucaria, when the Celians had very strong ties to Raya Lucaria, with Lusat and Azur founding like the oldest of the conspectuses and being from Celia themselves. So maybe you could argue that like Renala bewitched them, and that's why there was the issue that they had, but I don't know. I don't think that matches up super well with territorial aggressions. I do like the idea of Celia and Ordina and whatnot being previous Nox or Eternal City settlements that were under the control of Marica to a degree, because we do have like the first Church of Marica in the consecrated snowfield, or like the mountaintops of the giants, whatever. And that's not like super distant from the Eternal City ruins of like Ordina, I guess, but I don't know. Like, it's just a bit of a mess, but I do agree that Cosmos brings up a good point with the Nox architecture of the Wandering Mausoleums. That has been something that's annoyed me for a long time. And just to jump around topics even more, I wonder where Cosmos fits in Farum Azula in relation to Caelid and or Godfrey's conquest of the Lands Between, because like the Bestial Sanctum in like northeast or northern Caelid, whatever you want to call it, does seem like it would be culturally at odds with the Celians, but we don't really have like a lot of remaining archaeological evidence for like a full-blown conflict between the factions in Caelid, and part of that may be due to Scarlet Rot obscuring things a bit more, but who really knows? Cal0 says, it would potentially explain Gideon's line that Marica's grief was legit after finding out Moog's kidnapping and the unfulfilled potential of the Halig tree contributed to like Marica's situation. Yeah, I see what you guys are saying. I don't think Marica really cared that Godwin, her son, died, and I believe the reason she was driven to the brink was because of Deathroot, more specifically, but of course that's just like my interpretation of events there. Phaled says, fully a tinfoil hat, but a fun one. The whole of the Lands Between could be on a walking creature like the Mausoleums, so you just have it on the shell of a great turtle, Atuin, the only being who knows where he's going in the universe.
Even though it would seem nonsensical that she would start an order just to destroy it, the answer is that Marica's plot and actions result in an outcome that has a much broader and meaningful impact than just the fall of the Golden Order, which we'll be exploring later in the final video of this emancipation theory. I am sorry for leaving something for another time again, but the truth is that I need to set all these building blocks in order to convey the bigger picture, and I will still need to talk about these subjects on screen before all the pieces are in place, so please bear with me. But for now, we have to ask, why would the Fingers elect an Empyrean from the race that challenged the Greater Will, has been punished for it, and is still being punished for it to this day? It would be common sense not to give power and support to an individual that has plenty of reasons to resent you and has turned against you once already. And although we can conjecture a few reasons as to why the Fingers would still choose Marica, the game already seems to have a neat little answer to that question already. As it so happens, the Eternals are in possession of a secret rite, which requires a treasured and rare substance to conduct. The effect of this rite is the total and complete undoing of all antagonizations. Well, isn't that awfully convenient? Through the power of fate, Celestial Dew, treasure of the Eternal City, allows one to conduct the rite of absolution in a fountain in front of the Nox priestess. And so, even if Marica has always harbored animosity towards the Greater Will, as long as she treads carefully and keeps her true intentions hidden, she would be able to carry out her scheme until the course of events to come could not be altered.
And one thought that I've had in relation to the Celestial Dew baptism is if that was like the catalyst that triggered the sudden realization of consciousness in Radigan, that like he wasn't really himself up until he got married to Renala, and then like the consciousness finally kicked on within him. So did that change him? Maybe. I could see a way where that could work, but yeah, it seems like there's like a lot more to that scenario specifically that is just unresolved, because like Muriel talks about how he doesn't want the blessing of the Church of Vows to be squandered again, and there is nothing worse than like breaking a vow, and that feels very ominous for a very gentle and sweet NPC to say, I think, for the most part. So I've wondered how significant that is truly meant to be in the grand scheme of the game, and I think it's one that's really slept on, to be honest. But anyway.
Which brings us to the final subject I would like to talk about today: fate. Throughout the video, the word has reared its head a few times, but I cannot stress enough how important this notion is. You see, there is an aspect of the world building of this setting that is only ever mentioned twice as far as I know. And one such occasion was the original reveal trailer of Elden Ring, dating back to even before the age of Halloween in 2019.
That which commanded the stars, giving life its fullest brilliance. The Elden Ring. Oh, Elden Ring.
The Elden Ring, that which commanded the stars. In this world, astrology is very much real, and the fate that governs the existence of beings seems to be quite literally written in the night sky. To control the stars means to control fate, and that is the fearsome power of the Elden Ring itself. It is fate that sits at the center of this ancient conflict between the Nox and the Greater Will. You see, Marica is the vessel of the Elden Ring and as such hold its power she is free to use as the sole god of her own order. And so her scheming becomes a lot more sinister when you consider she has some level of control over the very fate of the people itself. And we actually know for a fact that the events orchestrated by Marica were actually also written in the tapestry of fate. During the Golden Order, it is said that carrying astrology fettered at the vines, and reading fate in the stars was not possible. However, there is another way people can peer into destiny, and that is through their faith. Those are known as prophecies, and they show the fatality of the curse Marica placed on the land. It is said that sometimes priests of the Golden Order would glimpse the prophecy of cardinal sin in their faith, showing them the burning of the earth tree which would come when the Tarnished would become Elden Lord. And it does not stop there. As it happens, we have multiple instances of visions that all show different parts of the same scenario that is to be played out.
Do you know of the noble Gold Mask? Though he was but a tarnished, living outside the lands between, he was a great scholar who foresaw the coming guidance of grace. And now, I hear he has come to the lands between alone to contemplate the Golden Order.
Goldmask, an eminent Golden Order fundamentalist and scholar, through his research into Order, managed to predict the return of the Tarnished and the Call of Grace long before it happened. Not only a testament of his genius and insight, but also a demonstration of the inevitability of events to come.
So just to give a bit more context about that, it's that Goldmask saw his own coming of grace, which kind of made him be like the prophet master, essentially. But I do have something else I want to say, but I want him to like complete his thoughts here, so I'll just put it in the notes and move on.
The one who walks alongside flame shall one day meet the road of destined death. Goodbye. The fingers I served once prophesied a tarnished would one day become Elden Lord and restore the Golden Order.
The Prophecy of Flame, as it is called, also directly ties the burning of the Earth Tree to the subsequent freeing of destined death. And finally, even the two fingers foresaw the ultimate crowning of a tarnished as Elden Lord. The Call of Grace, the burning of the Earth Tree, the unsealing of destined death, and the ascension of a tarnished to the throne of Elden Lord. All unthinkable events that form every beat of the scenario played out in-game, were all foretold by vastly different people from different times. This scheme was directly engraved into fate itself. It isn't to say that every detail is set in stone or that there is no escape, since clearly the Lord of Frenzied Flame exists. But then again, if anything would shatter the influence of the Elden Ring, it would be chaos itself, its anathema. But besides that, every ending regardless of the variation plays out exactly as Marica wanted. And the realization that she had a hand directly meddling in fate makes the shattering war all the more sinister. She forced her children against one another, which resulted in the stalemate that allowed the Tarnished to pick off the demigods one by one in a land between weakened and ravaged by war. So was it even possible for things to have gone differently at all then? After all, the return of the Tarnished was hinging on the shattering war coming to a stalemate. It seems to me that they were set up to fail. Now, there is a lot more to say about fate specifically and why it is the center of the conflict and the various things and forces that have sway over it, but you guessed it, it's gonna be for another video. So for now, this is everything I have to say in relation to Marica specifically. And in short, here is my proposition. Marica was never loyal to the Greater Will and the Two Fingers. She carries with her the dreams of an ancient civilization who were once crushed for opposing their control. And when she was chosen to be the god of the New Age, the vessel of the Elden Ring and holder of its power, she started enacting her plan, making preparations throughout the history of her age, all in anticipation for the day she would shatter the Elden Ring, initiating the cascade of events that would lead to their ultimate goal, with the whole of the lands between, her children, and the Tarnished cursed to play their fated role on the board. Thank you everyone for watching. The next video is going.
Was that intentional? I wonder if he like superimposed an image. It kind of looks like he did. So yeah, that's kind of an interesting visual there. So it looks like there's a person, a Jesus.
On the board. Thank you everyone for watching. The next video is going to be about the Eternal Cities, their ties to the ancient dynasty, and how they were destroyed by the Greater Will. I hope you look forward to it. I am sure many of you have plenty of questions and they will be answered in time. Until then, I want to hear what you all think, so do not hesitate to leave a comment as I do try to read them all. If you want to support my channel, be sure to like and subscribe, and share the video with anyone interested in Elden Ring lore. We are so incredibly close to the Shadow of the Earth Tree trailer at the Game Awards, so keep an eye out for a deep dive on that too. And with all that being said, goodbye.
Alright, yeah, so that was a very enjoyable video, even though I obviously
The
have
story of Elden Ring.
some of my own disagreements about it. I mean, would it be me reacting to a video if I agreed with it completely? So anyway, here is the link for the video that we just watched by Cosmos, Understanding Queen Marica. So I did enjoy it. It does have some pretty interesting thoughts, many of which, you know, I've pondered a time or two myself. Obviously, it wasn't as... it doesn't provide as many, like, clear-cut answers as one would hope, which is to be expected based on this topic, but I think overall it was a good video. It had very good pacing. The audio and everything was done well. There were a few discrepancies between like the spoken words and the subtitles at times, but I mean, sometimes that's just the nature of what you've got scripted out versus what you actually say when you're pressing the record button. So anyway, that was a good video, Cosmos. I enjoyed it. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about in relation to what he brought up is related to the notes that I have down here at the bottom. And so he didn't really go into this in super depth, so I will talk about it briefly and then we'll move on to the next video. But in the earliest versions of the trailers where they talk about the Elden Ring commanding the stars, I think that is probably more specific to a certain time in the game's development, and I think they walked that back later on. So what I mean by that is, I think in their early initial conceptions of what the Elden Ring is, it was, and what it does is that it did control the fate and the like law and the order of the universe, but in the retail build of the game, I don't think the Elden Ring always had the power to command the stars, which is why Carian astrology withered on the vine after it got fettered by the Golden Order. That implies to me that the Elden Ring didn't have as much control over the stars as Golden Order adherents would let on, and that might also tie into why Radahn held up the fate in the night sky. So, if the Elden Ring is doing its job, why does Radahn need to do anything? Is Radahn rebelling against the Order? Maybe. There's, you know, woefully little about Radahn and his motivations, his connections to the other Carian children beyond, like, the one portrait in Volcano Manor. And now he's growling like a dog, essentially. So we're not gonna get a lot of answers from him. So anyway, I wanted to bring that up. Oh yeah, and then the other thing with Radagon and Radahn is I have wondered whether their roles were reversed, because if you look at the 1.00 versions of the Chinese descriptions, we have some very, very interesting discrepancies, which could be, you know, mistranslations for all I know, but at the very least, the Sword of Night and Flame for the Chinese version of 1.0 talks about Radagon being the Slayer of Giants or something like that. And that earlier was the role that Radahn had. So, like, in that trailer, I think that Cosmo showed Radahn was called the Slayer of Giants, but 1.0 Sword of Night and Flame called Radagon the Slayer of Giants, and fire was more associated with Radagon, which might tie into how, like, the Giant's braid talks about the redness of his hair and, like, that potentially being a curse. So, if that was the case, that the roles got switched around, and then Radagon was related to slaying giants, but wait, no, Radahn was also related to slaying giants. Could that mean that Radagon eventually got the role reversal of originally commanding the stars because he was the Elden Lord, and then that got shuffled onto Radahn, and then like the whole like giant slaying thing just got like nixed completely? I think it's a very strong possibility, a very messy possibility, and I know like a lot of these kind of, I can't really call them retcons, but changes in direction would seem to fly in the face of having a very strong George R.R. Martin blueprint of the game, which is why I am a bit more skeptical about claims of George R.R. Martin's role in the story, because there's a lot of discrepancies which wouldn't make sense if they were really following a blueprint to the T. So I think if George R.R. Martin provided things for the developers, it must have been very bare bones, and they still had the freedom to do what they want, because there have been so many changes that we still have like evidence of in the final build. El Gusto took it as a line meant the Elden Ring controlled the mechanism of the universe. So yes, I don't disagree with that, but I think the idea of it commanding the fate and the stars specifically is a more, or became a more defined thing later on in development. Alright, so let's go ahead and share the video again if you guys want to give Cosmos a like and a sub. And then we will be moving on into the next video by Wenders, Dark Souls Lore, Will, Duty, and Suffering. And so I've known Wenders for a very long time now, so I'm really excited to be able to watch this and share it with you guys. Alright.
In every Dark Souls game, the character is undead, which means that they are afflicted with the undead curse, as proven by the dark side stock in their inventory as an item. Dark Souls 2 in particular has a strong focus on the curse, and describes its effect in the introduction cutscene.
You will lose everything once branded the symbol of the curse, an augur of darkness, your past, your future, your very light. None will have meaning, and you won't even care. By then you'll be something other than human, a thing that feeds on souls. A hollow.
An undead is bound to lose their souls, thus becoming hollow, a creature who typically feeds on other souls without any self-restriction. Shadalot says that the sign they bear, so in all likelihood the aforementioned dark sign, is what drains their souls, and eventually leads the undead into turning hollow. Shadalot also adds that the bear of the curse needs to stay strong in order to not hollow. This statement might not sound like anything particularly meaningful at first, but in reality is probably tied to a rather hidden but important concept, which is the concept of will, or strength of will, of the character.
Right, and I absolutely agree with what Wenders is saying here. I am going to take a very, maybe not hardline stance, but a very controversial stance and say that I don't necessarily think it's the losing of souls which causes people to go hollow. I think that's kind of a symptom of what's happening with like the dark sign and whatnot. But I believe that the undead curse is actually a byproduct of the flame, and losing one's darkness is what causes them to become hollow. But the thing is, it's not very clear what exactly the difference is between a hollow and something that's dark and like preys on everything, because they kind of end up becoming similar things. So I think it's like the idea of balance, of yin and yang being completely out of balance, which creates the hollow essentially. And I've got a lot more to talk about that. I'll probably make like another dedicated video about that, going into it a bit more directly at some point in the future. So why do I bring this up now? I think this idea of having a strong will is meant to relate to darkness, because it's a kind of dark emotion, which ties into things like the Pursuer's spell, or Affinity, I think it's called in Dark Souls 2, and where the will pursues its target, and it's just a very dark aligned thing.
Will is mentioned in the dark sign description of Dark Souls 2 as something that one needs to hold on to in order to retain their consciousness and, consequently, to not go hollow. Hollow is a progressive state. As Shanalot says, when an undead dies, it is never truly dead, but only one step closer to hollowing. In Dark Souls 3, the HP statistic is synonymous with the will of the Ashen One. In that game, the degree of hollowing is shown through the hollow stat that fills up upon each death if the Ashen One carries at least one Dark Sigil. In other words, losing all of your HP, or will, brings the Ashen One closer to the state of hollow. The same roughly applies in Dark Souls 2, where upon each death the amount of total HP, or will, of the bearer of the curse decreases as a sign that they are progressively turning into a hollow. To be
And one thing that's very interesting and somewhat annoying about that like little cycle there is it isn't necessarily death or draining souls specifically, because you can use the dark sign to quote unquote die in Dark Souls 3 at least, but you don't go hollow And I'm pretty sure that's also the case in Dark Souls 1. I don't remember. I know I have footage of it somewhere and I've like tested it, but it's just been a long time, to be honest. All right, so Scaleezy says they think it's the barrier between life and death weakening which causes undeath to start showing up. So one idea I've had, which is something I'm still like very on the fence about, is that death in general may be an illusion that was imposed upon the undead by Nito, quote unquote, offering his soul up to death. And so with the hollows and men giving a quote like fleeting vessel a false soul, I've wondered whether or not that whole concept of life and death is something that's been enforced upon them by the gods and or Nito and like offering souls to death. Methoda says, once people go hollow, do we know that they are meant to get out of collecting souls? Is it instinct to regain their sanity or just a natural thing to do in some metaphysical sense? So that's a very good question that has some very nuanced answers to it, because when we look at the sorceries of like Logan and the crystal ones specifically, we're shown that even souls seek other souls because they're drawn to life. So the same way that the dark is drawn to souls seems to be the case for souls in general, that souls are drawn to souls, at least in the crystal form. And in Dark Souls 3 specifically, we're told that the staff of the Crystal Sage, I think it's called, will absorb the soul of its user to like regain FP or something like that. Let me actually just pull up the description. Oops. Okay. Sage's crystal staff. Or not. Crystal spheres devour the will of the user, and this staff increases the potency of sorceries at the cost of increased FP consumption for skills. So, like the Dark's penchants for absorbing life itself by like consuming it, I think there's something similar going on with souls, in that like souls might be representations of fire, and they like consume souls by burning them. So I think there's kind of a mirror dual nature between souls and darkness, because I mean you have literally dark souls, you know. But anyway, as far as people going hollow are meant to be getting out of collecting souls, the one NPC that I often point to in regard to souls like staving away madness, which flies in the face of that idea, is Marlin in Dark Souls 2. Because when you give him 12,000 souls, he says, I'm rich. Home? Where's home? So like the more souls he has, the less sane he becomes, because he kind of loses his purpose for wanting those souls. His will, his drive, his desire is to get money. And once he has the money doesn't sustain him, essentially. So souls don't actually seem to stave off madness and whatnot, which is why I tend to believe like the rationality is contained within the darkness, which is why Gwyn couldn't allow an Age of Dark to happen, because his Age of Light is contingent on the dark being subservient to the light, I guess.
Freezes as a sign that they are progressively turning into a hollow. To be hollow is usually understood as an equivalent to being mindless. However, Dark Souls 3 brings a new hands to this preconception. Yuria establishes that a hollow needs not be mad, and that attacking her like a mad hollow translates to weakness. In a sense, this comment echoes what Shanalot says about the need to stay strong, only without the same assumption regarding hollow. Yuria's words are backed up by the existence of the Land of Hollows where Yuria herself comes from, Londor, which presumably is mostly populated by sane hollows. There are also characters such as Willem and Lap, who are both flagged as hollows and thus weak to the Holoslayer Greatsword, and yet are still sane, the second of whom also directly calls himself hollow.
That's very interesting. I didn't realize that Lap was weak to that sword. Yeah, that's something that I've meant to do for like a really long time, just never really got around to it because it's a bit tedious. is testing the hollowness of certain enemies and whether or not they take the bonus damage from the sword, because there's not a lot in the games which directly clarify what is and what is not a hollow. And so I know, like, my claims earlier that like hollows are beings that are not dark might seem extremely counterintuitive to the normal presentation of the game, where things like dark wraiths seem extremely dark. But I would argue that dark wraiths aren't actually hollow, and they don't actually take bonus damage from this thing. They have an abundance of dark and not like a loss of it, because they pursue the art of life drain to steal the darkness of others. So let me back up a little bit here, because I want to see who else he said was weak to it.
Saying hollows. There are also characters such as Willem and Lap, who are both flagged as hollows and thus weak to the Hollow Slayer Greatsword, and yet are still sane, the second of whom also directly calls himself hollow.
So right, there's always a bit of messiness between the idea of like a mad hollow and a normal hollow or an undead. Maybe I should start by saying like undead versus hollow to like help differentiate the two. So, Bella, welcome into the stream. Scaleezy said, would it be accurate to use soulless as a synonym for hollows? I don't necessarily think so, because like you can become soulless as the champion of Ash without the dark sigils, you know, arguably speaking here. It's just really messy, because some of it is like gameplay mechanics versus not.
Lap in particular is implied to have a strong will of his own. Much like Lucatir from Dark Souls 2, the curse erodes his memory to the point that his own identity becomes blurred. To scoff that effect off, Lap repeats to himself that he's unbreakable. In other words, he tries to remind himself of his true identity. Unbreakable Patches, a fitting title for a strong-willed character who explicitly never gives up, never breaks, and doesn't succumb to madness. As told by the official Trilogy Compendium, one way to not fall victim to unrestricted thirst for souls is to sustain one's.
So I don't necessarily buy the Trilogy Compendium, because it seems to have been made by non-primary sources, and they don't seem to have more info than we do. Maybe I'm wrong, but yeah. Anyway, it says, because souls help stave off the loss of sanity and self-awareness caused by the undead curse, they hold tremendous value for the afflicted and have become the de facto currency in virtually every undead community. Then, the violent behavior of hollows by the life-starved hollows' attraction to souls, which they are instinctively driven to consume. So I don't like disagree with that specifically. But I don't necessarily believe that souls help stave off the loss of sanity, because what I just showed a moment ago with like the Crystal Sage's staff, showing us that crystals, which are like super concentrated souls, are also capable of devouring the will, and also Malin's predicament in Dark Souls 2.
With these.
And then Stella asks, did the lords have souls before they found the Lord Souls? So maybe, but like the idea of souls may not have existed in quite the same capacity as we may be thinking. So there must have been some form of life before the lords found their Lord Souls, because Gwyn is said to have an uncle, like verbatim, in Allfather Lloyd, but we don't really know about the prehistoric culture that existed before the Age of Fire officially existed, and we do have some very vague references to that kind of culture. I think in the black gold hemmed robe from like Dark Souls 1, like the black set or the red one. No, the black one, because the red one's for the Ingvar dudes. I can't remember what they're called. Anyway, so there was some culture to a degree before like the Age of Fire first started, and to be fair, it doesn't seem like the Age of Fire started immediately like the second like Gwyn picked up the first Lord Soul. But anyway, that's a good question. Mr. Yadaization says, when you pick up soul items off of corpses, are those corpses hollows or dead? So that's a very good question. Technically speaking, I think they're supposed to be hollows, to the point that they like just don't have enough will to move that they're effectively dead. But yeah, I don't think it's ever like really made explicit. And in Dark Souls 2, they did something very interesting where like the most despairing of the hollows, or like the most dejected of the hollows, would literally start disappearing. So there are like 26 invisible hollows that you could kill throughout the game. But I do think it's very interesting that some hollows corpses have both souls and or humanity to pick up. So that's why I tend to think that it is meant to be a balance of souls and darkness, which creates the undead. El Degusto says, it still seems odd the Silver Knights became hollow when their ancestry was implied to be of the tribe of Gwyn rather than the Pygmies, unless they were like the tribe of Gwyn bred with the Pygmies. I don't believe the Silver Knights are hollow. I don't think they take extra damage, which could indicate that, but I might be wrong. I don't remember like the mechanic damage that each faction like takes for every enemy in the games. Simon Cat, welcome into the stream again. Nice to see you. The first flame seemed to have sparked souls in the hollow-like beings in the intro, and the Lord Souls were like a boost soul, which they used to enhance their families, possibly. Yeah, that's kind of how I look at it. So it's a little bit of like the question of like the chicken or the egg, like which came first, the Lords or the Lord Souls. I think like the equivalent of hollows, maybe like hollow is like isn't the best term for it, but like yeah. The little pygmy type dudes existed, and they were probably animated by souls as a byproduct of the disparity that the fire brought, but yeah. In Dark Souls 3, the Silver Knights take damage to hollow damaging attacks? Interesting. Okay, thanks for letting me know that.
Very souls, also stated to be a source of power. Consequently, it can be tempting to think that will and souls are mutually inclusive, and that the strength brought by souls is the same strength shared by people who don't go hollow. However, it should be kept in mind that the most common cause of hollowing is the loss of souls, and we just went over examples of hollows who retain their sanity through sheer mental strength. Besides, will and souls are distinguished by Alzana, who hints in a dialogue that even with a strong soul, sufficient strength of will is not a given. The Agape Ring description goes even further by saying that abstention from souls, so willingly sharing the same state as typical hollows, is proof of one's endurance.
If I remember correctly, there was actually like a little bit of a difference in the text. I'll like look it up over here off to the side and then stop the ring or stop the video again if I find it.
Thus, it is indeed possible to lack souls and still remain sane. Throughout Dark Souls 3 in particular, several characters seem to resist the typical undead fate of going hollow and mad by retaining a purpose, a duty. This is the case with Cirith, who after receiving help from the Ashen One with Odric during her quest, will suggest to loyally serve them for the rest of the game. Should the Ashen One accept, Cirith will still have a goal, and the Ashen One will eventually find her lying human body.
Okay, I'm gonna back up. I'm sorry. I probably should have realized that I would stop paying attention to him if I'm like looking at the text. Okay, yeah. So this is a little bit different. Oh, I don't know why I just didn't look at the literal English text right next to it. Okay, so all things are rooted in souls, but what drives our thirst for them? Abstinence from this elixir may be the truest homage to an enduring self. So the Japanese there is slightly different, where it says like, not desiring souls, which are like the what do you call it, like origin of everything, and just simply continuing to exist. It might also be another route, and it doesn't like really complete the sentence, but yeah. So that is a bit different, and so saying it's the truest homage to an enduring self is kind of a really strong break from like the localization there, or like from the Japanese there. So that's a little bit unfortunate. Does that really influence what Wenders is saying that much? I don't necessarily think so, but I think it's always important to have as much context about what our beliefs are built upon as we go along. So I just wanted to touch on that right there. Tried to start New Game Zero and Lords of the Fallen and it broke your game? That sucks, man. Just like patches utterly devoid of all worldly wants. Yeah, so it is a possible way to exist in the world, but it isn't necessarily the truest homage to an enduring self, is the big takeaway. Without Horn says, as far as the merchant in DS2 goes, maybe souls only stave off madness when they're used, i.e. leveling up, and just hoarding them as money doesn't do anything, ? So, yes, that is a strong possibility as well, but I think the biggest issue is that if hoarding souls is bad, is that because souls like burn and then they burn away like the darkness? I think that's a very strong possibility that the way that the dark sign works is it instills more and more fire into the undead until the point the darkness gets burned away and they become hollow. So if fire is supposed to be synonymous with a soul to some degree, then darkness seems to be like the actual human aspect of an undead, which kind of goes hand in hand with how humanity is like called humanness in Japanese. Like humanity, obviously it has that meaning in English, but it's just like a little bit clearer in Japanese that like the humanness is related to like the black sprite of the little dark souls and whatnot.
Thus, it is indeed possible to lack souls and still remain sane. Throughout Dark Souls 3 in particular, several characters seem to resist the typical undead fate of going hollow and mad by retaining a purpose, a duty. This is the case with Cyrus, who after receiving help from the Ashen One with Odric during her quest, will suggest to loyally serve them for the rest of the game. Should the Ashen One accept, Cyrus will still have a goal, and the Ashen One will eventually find her lying human body in the Filing Shrine Cemetery. On the other hand, if they refuse a proposal, Cyrus presumably doesn't have any duty left and will be found hostile and hollow-looking in the Pit of Hollows.
And that's another thing that's shared in common with Orbeck of Vinheim, and it is very interesting that rather than becoming hollows like the Crestfallen Warrior in Dark Souls 1, they fully just like become inanimate and dead in Dark Souls 3. So I wonder if that's like meant to be significant, that you can like go beyond hollowing and full on die if you lose all drive to continue. Maybe. So the way that I look at hollowing is like it's kind of like a spectrum, which is kind of what Wenders is talking about here loosely, in that in my mind it's like some combination of both soul and dark that has just been imbalanced to the point where they've kind of like lost their rationality, and it can like go like the bell curve of being a hollow ends with like death versus like humanity, I guess, or like the equivalent of death.
An even more explicit case of a duty serving as a way to resist hollowing is Henry's. After defeating Aldrich with the help of the Ashen One, Henry will relay their last words to Ludleth, who tells the Ashen Ones to not seek Henry, well aware of what awaits them after the duty is finished. This means they know that without any objective left, they will turn hollow and be hostile towards the Ashen One. I think duties can be understood as an exercise of will of some sort, like a mortal.
So this is where I would disagree with Wenders to an extent. Like, I don't think he's entirely wrong here, but there's probably like a little bit of nuance that is going to be extremely hard to parse. And the reason why I disagree has to deal with, I always forget his actual name, but Cyrus's grandfather, whom she fights. I always think it's Hodrick, but Hodrick is like Henri's boy. So anyway, when you become a mound maker, you kind of take on an everlasting mission similar to the League into increasing your family by killing others. And at that point, you are more or less indistinguishable from something that's insane, but you're not necessarily insane, ? And that might be something that Wenders might want to consider more. Maybe he just disagrees with me because like you could make the argument that he's not actually sane. He's just giving the appearance of insanity, which might just be like that one 4chan meme, I guess, if you guys know what I'm talking about. Is Orbeck undead or unkindled? That's a good question as well. He might be unkindled because Henri wants us to kill him. Not Henri, Uriel wants us to kill him. So that could be another discrepancy between what happens with Orbeck and some of the other characters from like the previous Dark Souls titles. And that's a good point as well. Thanks for bringing that up. Hunger seemed to be the last vestige to go, and when you lost your hunger in Dark Souls 1, you could become the quiescent hollow under Firelink Shine, and maybe the corpses you loot. Howdy says, the entire thing with Gwyn, humanity, the Dark Soul, and the Dark Sign, and hollowing is the most confusing concept to wrap your head around. Andrew says, they feel like hollowing being akin to dementia more overtly in DS2 makes the whole concept more easily digestible lore-wise. Feels like 3 kind of dropped that concept mostly. I can see where you're coming from. I do think it was, in general, Dark Souls 2 does present a better, like, humanizing picture of what it means to go hollow and why it's such like a terrible and frightening thing for the characters in that world. I will agree with you on that point for sure. But I don't necessarily think DS3 drops that concept mostly, although I totally understand where you're coming from. I think, and this is something that, you know, it took me a really long time to kind of wrap my head around, is that 3 is operating on the paradigm that the unkindled ash is fundamentally different from the chosen undead and or the bearer of the curse by the nature of being unkindled ash. And this is somewhat an issue of translation because as far as the English goes, when you hear unkindled ash, that makes it sound as though you have yet to be kindled or that, you know, you can be kindled. Whereas the Japanese is a bit more direct about it and says the equivalent of fireless or flameless ash. So like Hinonai Hai, which is like not having fire ash. So if you're ash in Dark Souls 3, you cannot have fire, I guess, even if you're embered. And I think that like plays into that description as well. And so if you can't have fire in Dark Souls 3, I think that is supposed to be the direct correlation as to why you don't naturally hollow, because the curse doesn't enter within you because you can't fully absorb the curse until you get the Dark Sigil, and then the darkness seeps out of the player. So I don't think the Dark Sigil seeps darkness into the player. The Japanese is slightly clear that like it like leaks out, I guess. So if you think of like a bursting pipe, that would be like the better way to visualize it. And I don't think that necessarily works with like filling a person up with darkness. I think it's the opposite case, which I think that's why in the fight with Gale, he becomes a hollow in the second phase of his fight when the darkness literally spills out of him in the form of his dark soul blood. Okay, going back to the video.
Thought that drives someone and allows them to keep going until they achieve what they want. It's also interesting to note that in Dark Souls 1, some characters such as Soler and Laurentius seem to interpret the shift to the undead condition as a kind of signal that they have a duty to accomplish, something they are fated to do. In a sense, they are on a timer, pressured by the looming threat of hollowing should they give up on that task. On the other side of the spectrum, characters who don't seem to retain any purpose and remain inactive are bound to turn hollow soon enough, as hinted by the crestfallen warrior and Rickard from Dark Souls 1. All this analysis regarding will and duties is relevant to the concept of kinghood in Dark Souls, since according to the official compendium, strength of will is a requirement to become a true king. This is not surprising, considering the arch fate that an aspiring monarch needs to go through, and is
Yeah, and there's something also a little bit different on one of the descriptions in the Japanese where like sitting on the throne, what you see before you is what you yourself wish it will be. And I don't remember the English description well enough to be able to like double check right now for like what item I'm thinking of. But yeah, it's a little bit stronger in Japanese, but you can still like get it here as Wenders is positing.
This directly applies to the bearer of the curse, who has to reach the throne eventually. In the design work interview of Dark Souls 2, Yui Tanimura says that the key term behind the whole game was Deep Curse. However, he wasn't thinking of the undead curse, but instead of the grim fate or karma conveyed by the characters, who have to shoulder an impossible duty. Agdain's set description states that this very karma is synonymous with life and suffering. The full explanation.
Yeah, and that's obviously a very important bit of a description right there. And this is very directly related to Buddhism, so it's actually really good that we have like the Buddhism video to look at next, because life itself is dukkha, or suffering, and suffering comes off like a little bit stronger in English, but like dissatisfaction might be like another way of thinking about it. But I'll leave that alone for now.
Of how karma or life works in Dark Souls will require its own lengthy analysis, but as made clear by Tanimura, the concept is extremely important to the lore of Dark Souls 2 and should be kept in mind. In fact, the term fate in the English version can usually be translated as karma, and that word is very prominent in the game. Upon their arrival at Majula, Shanalot asked the bearer of the curse, supposedly destined to lose their souls over and over again until they break and turn hollow, whether they are the next monarch or merely a pawn of fate. She will tell them to seek King Vendrick, and to achieve that, the bearer of the curse needs to actively face hardships in order to make their souls strong enough to reach the king. Vendrick himself echoes the same sentiment in his dialogue. Suffering allows one to become more powerful, and therefore someone who seeks power needs to go through hardships. Kings are holders of such strong souls, thus it only makes sense that the path to kinghood is a tough one. It should come as no surprise that the bearer of the curse needs a strong will in order to overcome their fate as an afflicted undead and aspiring monarch.
Right, and then that also ties into one of the other localization issues with like the like laughing firekeeper ladies that tell you that like you will die over and over without knowing why. God, I freaking hate that line. And Shanalot says something similar right before you go down to like the throne room, but the Japanese for it is a lot more, balanced, and says something along the lines that you will die over and over. No. It wasn't quite like that. I would need to like look at it. Yeah, let me just look at it real quick because it's gonna bother me if I don't. What's her face? Why? Okay. Then one day you will walk those grounds without really knowing why. So she says like you will eventually go there whether you wish to or not. So that's a very different take on things, and shows that at least in the Dark Souls universe that like power is meant to coalesce in on itself. Oops. And because of that, it kind of like leads people down to having the same fate of becoming a monarch the stronger they become, because the stronger you are, the more hardship you face. So it's just kind of like one of the biggest tropes of like shonen manga and anime, where it's like the stronger you are, the stronger enemies you need to face. And I think like they made fun of that in Batman versus Superman, where it's like Bruce Wayne was blaming Superman for like the escalation of like supervillains, essentially, like because Superman was so strong, it created like not like a power vacuum, but essentially like the equivalent of that, which like the villains would rise up to meet like the power level of Superman, essentially. And it was like wrecking Gotham, I guess. And where's Martha? Why did you say that name? So anyway. Howdy says, Gwyn created the dark sign which trapped humanity and attached the sign to the waning of the first flame And when humanity is unbound, it causes the undead curse, which leads to hallowing, right? So this is a very contentious topic. According to the Ringed Knight armor set in Dark Souls 3, the gods put the fiery seal on both the people and their armor because they were made of the abyss, essentially, so they had life within them. And the original purpose may have been that Gwyn wanted undying super soldiers to fight and defeat the dragons with, because we're told like the slave knights were like soldiers, essentially. They didn't really have an option in participating in the war, and that their history was erased for their participation in the wars and whatnot. So we don't exactly know Gwyn's motivations. Agdane and Koth tell us that Gwyn feared the dark and the coming age of man, and that may have just been because Gwyn was holding on to life as strongly as he possibly could, which is a through line between himself, the Witch of Izalith, whose hands are literally burned because, you know, she's trying to grasp at fire, and Seath, who's gone blind in his pursuit of immortality, and Nito is, you know, he exists. So yeah, we don't exactly know the full story behind the creation of the dark sign, except that it has to do with the domain of the gods. And according to Ingvard, curses themselves are the domain of the gods, which is a very interesting quote, I think. Jay says, demigods don't die, they return to the Erd Tree, right? So that's a good question. So I think they can die, but because they have like such strong like memories and or wills, a part of their being gets carved into like the roots or the trunk of the Erd Tree, and they can be like duplicated later on, I guess. It's strange. And then later on, like the what's the term for it? Over time, like the imitator becomes like reality. No, that's not quite right, but you get what I'm saying. Yeah, I don't... So, Gwyn eventually linking the fire himself is very interesting, because the way that I feel about it is it seems like Gwyn made a last-ditch effort to try to link the flame himself, so that way his age didn't end. But I think he had been working with Seath and Priscilla trying to create a fully undead being that could like house the flame and allow them to prolong the Age of Fire indefinitely. But I don't think they ever succeeded, and I think that kind of gets repeated with the existence of Shanalot in Dark Souls 2 being a child of dragons created by men. But yeah, so I don't necessarily think his goal was to push down men specifically as much as it was to prolong the Age of Fire. And then the situation became so dire, he felt he had no alternative than to cast himself into the fire, perhaps. And so what the dark sign is meant to do is very unclear. Like I've said earlier in the stream, I've wondered whether the original purpose of the dark sign is to give men a kind of false death. So it essentially like keeps them dead. And then once the strength of the first flame begins to fade, so does the strength of the fire on the dark sign. And so if the fire begins to weaken, that means the power of death begins to weaken, and so that might be why the undead can rise again. That is one potential reading that I'm like toying with a bit more. I don't entirely know if it like works completely, but it's kind of attractive to me, at least for now. Yes, Nito, the only god that decided, you know what, I'm just gonna chill. Yeah. His wife left him. He was a little depresso. Jay Bowden says, they always felt like the gods in all these games are just powerful. Like the Japanese emperor was once considered a god. You know, they have different souls. Maybe soul type equals physical size. And that's another popular idea. Soul size and power isn't necessarily like entirely equivalent to the size of a person in Dark Souls, although there is certainly a correlation at times with Ornstein and Smo becoming bigger in their second phase of the fight, and or Gale becoming bigger as he's eaten everybody, essentially. So, like, he's not, like, a gigantic dude, but he's bigger than he was when we first encounter him in the Cathedral of the Deep. Alright. I've gone off topic long enough. Let's go ahead and go back on into the video.
By definition, the karma that burdens the characters means that everything they do will have a consequence sooner or later. In this case, power is the consequence of the suffering a would-be monarch has to come through. The description of the Old Sun Ring pretty much defines the concept of karma, and its effect exemplifies it further. The wearer needs to suffer, to take damage, in order to be rewarded by the explosion triggered upon taking enough hits. Another ring with a very similar effect is the Ring of Thorns, worn by Pate, who is implied to have fought countless battles and made his spear stronger by doing so. In other words, he went through a lot of hardships and grew stronger. Once again, the wearer of the ring needs a lot of HP, or will, to benefit from the ring and the suffering it encourages to go through. Fittingly, the ring's description contains the only mention of the god of struggle in the game, Kreml.
That's kind of funny. I didn't think about that. But yeah, I was going to say I liked the comparison that he was making here.
In Japanese, Karl Mao. In the Dark Souls 2 official guide, it is directly stated that suffering leads to great power in the mimic description, to describe cursed beings who might drop the symbol of avarice, which ignores that one health, but also gives greater chance of getting extra rewards by defeating enemies and bosses.
And this is something that also kind of conceptually carries over into Elden Ring with the prisoner class and its starting helmet, talking about how the despair that it induces can like lead to like more power or something along those lines. I know like I didn't quote it like super well right then, but yeah.
Once again, suffering is rewarded. In Dark Souls 3, will is stated to be synonymous with HP according to the stat description. Hollowing is a process that is usually caused by a loss of souls upon death, and hollowing is usually tantamount to madness. We already went over the link between will and consciousness. However, with this in mind, there is something that is a bit confusing. In some languages of the games, such as French or Italian, the attunement staff is simply translated to will as well. This inconsistency between the versions of the games might be the result of a not up-to-date script, but it may still be relevant to some extent.
That's really unfortunate. Yeah. I didn't realize that the attunement stat was like literally memory power.
Aside from hollowing, another recurring cause of madness throughout the sequel is the study of sorceries, as shown through characters such as Sif and Logan. Specifically, both of them study crystal sword sorceries, and it is stated in Dark Souls 3 that crystal spheres drain the will of the user. This would imply that Sif and Logan's sorcery caused a loss of will, leading them to eventually go mad, much like the wide majority of Hollows.
Right, and that was something I mentioned earlier, and one thing that I was thinking about fairly recently, to be honest, was why does Sith's crystal magic curse, but Logan's doesn't? That was very interesting to me. Maybe like there's more of an affinity between Sith and crystal specifically, so it draws out more of the will of the target than Logan's white dragon breath can conjure up. I don't know. But anyway, there is also like, I guess I should talk about like, maybe Wenders will talk about it now, but yeah, I'll stop talking and see if he talks about it.
Stat that increases spell usage is indeed tied to will, then it will make sense for casting tools such as the Tin Crystallized Catalyst in Dark Souls 1 to halve the number of spell used, and for the Sage Crystal Staff from Dark Souls 3 to have a very FP-hungry steady chant. This could be gameplay-related applications of crystal draining will.
Yeah, and that's an interesting comparison to make as well, and I think that's some pretty interesting sleuthing. I don't know if it like fully pans out, but you know, it definitely has me got my curiosity piqued. And so what was I going to say about, oh yeah, crystals and will being sucked out of the target is very interesting because through the white dragon's breath that Seath and what's his face Osiris can inflict upon the player, they can cause petrification, which is like a deep curse affliction, which is something that can also happen when somebody is exposed to the dark too much. So there is kind of a burning the candle at both ends, both metaphorically and literally in this game, I think. Non-binary Ava says, if Gwyn wasn't a clown who wanted the Age of Fire to last forever, where do you think the world could have gone if the Age of Darkness was allowed to start naturally after the Age of Fire? So I typically view the Age of Darkness as a bit of a misnomer, because once the fire fades, there is no more dark, because disparity will be driven out of the world and everything will become uniform again, and it will probably return to an age of arch trees, fog, and gray crags and gray mist. So that's right. I believe what would become the Age of Dark is essentially a return to an Age of Ancients, which I think is correlated directly to how the Firekeeper in Dark Souls 3 says that the flame of the lords dance on the horizon, implying that the cycle will repeat itself over again, just in a more holistic, natural fashion, even if everything does fade initially. Mr. Yadization says, if curses are the domains of gods, then maybe these sorceries are just extra saucy from the Lord Soul. That's an interesting way of thinking about it, but we also have Osiris to consider, but yeah, I like that. And El Gusto says pretty much the same thing. Okay. Goddess Beget says, darkness is an absence of light. It could be a wide range of things, not necessarily bad. Not exactly. Like, in real life, that's kind of true that darkness is the absence of light. But within Dark Souls, dark is said to have been born of fire. And so, of course, like that quote specifically comes from Vendrick, but it kind of gets repeated in a lot of other ways, which the examples are just kind of like eluding me off the top of my head right now. But yeah, I don't necessarily think that darkness is the absence of light. Sort of. I mean, it is. I think the reason that the abyss is dark is because the light doesn't reach it right now. But I think if there was no fire, there wouldn't be dark, because dark is made because of the disparity that light provides it. So, to put it another way, let's look at our good old buddies, the humanity sprites. Uh-oh. Computer slow. DS1. Okay, this will be good enough. So here is like the equivalent of the humanity sprite from Dark Souls 3, and the way that it gets its shape is by having light to contrast it from its surroundings. And this is a little bit more apparent in Dark Souls 1 when you're in like the chasm of the abyss, essentially. So like, if you take away what I would call like the soul mist of the light around them, the darkness blends into itself, and then that's how like Agdane is talking about humans being one with dark. The reason they were one with the dark is because when light didn't exist, everything was one. So anyway, light is what gives them form. So yeah, I'm just kind of repeating myself here. If it returns to the primordial age, where does the humans equals dark thing fit in? I think I just talked about that, or humans in general. So I think there is a little bit of yin yang. Oh man, did I like lose my spot?
Identical applications.
I'll back up. So I think humans are just innately dark, just because of their nature in Dark Souls, and then that was their luck of the draw, I guess. I don't really have a better reason beyond that. You think darkness and mist is like quantum uncertainty? So all things are possible until light locks it in a pattern of definition of what is in the unseen. And that's kind of how I referred to the abyss as like, I'm sorry, the dog's distracting me. How I refer to like the idea of the abyss as the parallel or parable of like what it means to have form and formlessness. So to explain that a bit more clearly here, if you take a ball of clay and shape it into a form of a cup, what makes the cup the cup? Many people would say it's obviously the shape of the clay which makes the cup a cup, but the only reason the cup is able to function is because of the hollow within it. Without the hollow, without the shapelessness there, the cup is no longer a cup. So form is only like one half of the equation, and focusing on form makes somebody ignore the whole. So what does that have to do with Dark Souls? If the world is like the abyss, which is our equivalent of a ball of clay, we could say that clay itself is like the light, and that darkness is the hollow, the formlessness. So with light forming into a humanity sprite, essentially, that which is not light is defined as dark as a byproduct of the light, but because of the darkness inside it, the light is also given its form as well. So like, form, I think, is kind of related to light in Dark Souls, and light is time in Dark Souls, and once that all goes away, we go back to an age of ancients where you have timeless, everlasting dragons. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, going back to the video.
From Dark Souls 3 to have a very FP hungry steady chant. This could be gameplay related applications of crystal draining will. Without going too much into details, will is a recurring theme in other From Software games with nearly identical applications to Dark Souls. This includes the loss of will caused by the use and study of magic, or the
Right, so feedback for Wenders is the music is slightly loud here in comparison to your voice. So I typically like to put the background tracks at like 20 decibels lower than the like peaks of my voice. Hopefully that'll help.
the equivalence between max HP and will. Here are a few examples. The Insanity Catalyst from Demon Souls have the FP bar in a very similar manner to the Thin Crystallized Catalyst from Dark Souls 1. The Madness Affliction in Elden Ring drains both HP and FP. The Deathbed Companion Fia asks the Tarnished to share their will with her, which results in a loss of max HP. The Frenzy Affliction in Bloodborne causes a heavy loss of HP, also equated to will. The Blue Elixir description even goes on saying that hunters resist madness through strength of will.
Although to be fair, the version of will in the Blue Elixir is technically different from this version of will. They're synonyms in that they're pronounced exactly the same, but the kanji is different. So the will in Bloodborne here is like the dying will of somebody, as opposed to just like the volition of somebody with this one. Oh, okay, I guess that was it. That's a little bit unfortunate. So, all right. All right, so nonetheless, I really enjoyed the video. A longtime friend of Wender's. His channel is kind of just starting out. So if you guys would do me a solid and like visit his video and or kindly like leave it running in the background or something, or just give him a like, I'm sure that would also help him out as well. So good job, Wenders. Obviously we have our disagreements, but that's always part of the fun of analyzing the lore there. So Non-Binary says, something interesting about Gwyn is how his desire to keep the world in the state of a messed up but stable status quo led to the world figuratively and literally burning itself to ash. True. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive on into our last video of the night with the parallels between Dark Souls and Buddhism. Now, I'm very excited about this topic. I think I've talked about this on stream before, but I've wanted to like use some quotes by Alan Watts to help contextualize like Eastern religion and Buddhism within the confines of Dark Souls, but I got denied permission to do that, so I guess we're just going to have to deal with how life is suffering. So anyway, hopefully this video will help bridge that gap that I do find in the understanding of Buddhism as it relates to Dark Souls, and that might be a topic that I will like visit in a video like way on down the line. So anyway,
Dark Souls is a game that
okay, let's do this, and this. All right, here we go.
Dark Souls is a game that, to me, fundamentally encourages exploration. Its interconnected level design, along with its boss fights, kept me thoroughly engaged throughout my entire experience playing the game. I mean, seriously, I felt neurons firing in my head that have never been used before. But in this video, instead of talking about its brilliant game design, I want to speak on its lore and how it relates to the theology of Buddhism. Dark Souls has an incredibly obscure and enigmatic way of dispersing its lore, through its item descriptions, vague dialogue, and sparse but poignant cutscenes. The more I played this game, the less I felt I knew about the lore. But thankfully we have channels like Vati Vidya. They break down the lore in terms that someone like me with 2 brain cells glued together can understand. And the more I learned about Dark Souls' lore, the more I could relate its own themes to my religion, Buddhism. And I don't want to be that guy that just inserts their own religion to every piece of media on this planet, but there were a lot of similarities that I just want to go over, so let's get into it. The world of Dark Souls is a world of cycles. Life and death, fire and ash. These concepts go hand in hand. Prior to the events of the first game, there was an age of the ancients. Giant stone dragons roamed the world, in relative peace and harmony. That is until the first flame ignited, and gave birth to all new beings. 3 beings in particular would be granted 3 Lord Souls from the flame.
So, another fun thing about like the dragons is I don't know if they're necessarily like roaming around at this time. And part of the reason why I bring that up specifically is because in Ash Lake, the little bonfire dragon down there is sitting in the Zazen pose, which is a Buddhist meditative pose. So there is some kind of like overt connections to like Buddhism and Dark Souls in that. And that's also its internal name, like Zazen Yu. So like Zazen dragon.
In relative peace and harmony. That is until the first flame ignited, and gave birth to all new beings. 3 beings in particular would be granted 3 Lord Souls from the flame. Nido, the Lord of Death, the Witch of Izalith, the Lord of Life, and now Chaos, which at times go hand in hand. And most importantly, Gwyn, the Lord of Light. And there's one other being that claimed a soul from the fire. The furtive pygmy.
So easily forgotten.
Who discovered the Dark Soul, which bestowed humanity to the human-like beings of the world. Gwyn and the army that he commanded, along with the other lords, would then go on to wage a war against the ancient dragons, exterminating them completely. He then established his kingdom in Lordran and took his place as lord, beginning his Age of Fire, bringing in
exterminating them completely. Terms and conditions may apply. Oops.
end to the Age of Ancients. So how does this relate to Buddhism? One of the main tenets of Buddhism is that nothing will last forever, and everything is impermanent. This same concept applies to the first flame as well, as it started to die out in the midst of Gwyn's Age of Fire. Gwyn and his desire for his power and influence to last forever commits what's now known as the first sin by using himself and his powerful soul as cinder to link the flame and keep the Age of Fire going longer.
And that might be meant to relate, obviously, there to the first sin, with like the scholar of the first sin being Aldia and all that nonsense. I do have a video where I talk about that in detail. If you guys are interested, it's like, I don't even remember the titles of my own videos. That's how good I am with names. Okay.
The term Dhamma in Buddhism refers to the natural order or universal laws of the universe. It means that to uphold these laws is a fundamental aspect of Buddhism. This could explain why Gwyn linking the first flame is the first sin, because he disrupted the natural order of the world, which in turn upset its balance. The first flame itself is impermanent. It was meant to give birth to new life and subsequently die out, which would have been its natural progression had Gwyn not stopped it. And by the time of Dark Souls 1, the flame is once again fading, and it's up to you to link it again, giving you the choice to continue the cycle or end it. Many think that the Link the Fire ending is the good ending, but I'd argue that to keep the flame alive is to keep the cycle of suffering alive. And we can see the toll that takes on the world by the time of Dark Souls 3. At this point, countless kingdoms have risen, countless have fallen, and all are laden in suffrage. Another core concept in Buddhism is samsara. Its direct translation from Sanskrit means world. In Buddhism, samsara is the suffrage-laden cycle of death and rebirth, also known as the Wheel of Existence. This concept is one that I see throughout Dark Souls. The world itself is cyclical in nature, with kingdoms being born, destroyed, reborn again over and over. In Buddhism,
And this is something that is like directly mentioned in the Japanese text of like the seed of a tree of giants in Dark Souls 2. It like mentions samsara directly. In Elden Ring, I believe that the Scarlet Rot is talked about as the cycle of samsara, like of birth and death, essentially. And so it's a very typical like Japanese thing where it's kind of like disambiguated from the religion to a certain degree, but it obviously has like those religious ties, kind of similarly to the way that like the idea of how we just use like Christian terminology that doesn't necessarily have to tie to like the Christian setting specifically, like with talking about like the celestial dew being a baptism. So obviously it has like religious connotations, but it isn't inherently religious on its own. And then the whole thing with like samsara and rinne is pretty prominent in a bunch of like shonen anime and manga, like Naruto, with like the whole like rinnegan. Like rinne is, you know, samsara, and then gan is the eye, so it's like the samsara eye. But anyway, it's kind of going really off topic now.
Buddhism, that unending cycle of suffrage and life, followed by death and rebirth, is one that's kind of viewed as a curse in a way. Nirvana is achieved through breaking this cycle, and I'll explain how later. So, does that unending cycle of death and rebirth sound familiar? Yeah, it's literally the curse of the undead. Like almost everything in Dark Souls' lore, it's not explained where or why the curse of the undead came into existence. My personal headcanon is that it's from Gwyn's unnatural continuation of the first flame that the curse of the undead came into existence. It kind of acts as a counterforce to the unbalance that was created. As the flame begins to die out, more and more humans who bear the Dark Soul become afflicted with the Dark Sign, a ring of fire that surrounds and slowly burns away their Dark Soul, and in turn, their humanity. This dark sign is what causes the curse of the undead. The curse causes those afflicted to resurrect upon death indefinitely. Each time one dies and comes back to life, they slowly lose their mind and sense of selves until they fully go mad. This is called hollowing. These undead are cursed to a life of suffrage, death, and rebirth indefinitely, which is very similar to that concept of samsara.
And to tie it like more strongly into Buddhism specifically there, like the term hollowing is a really good localization, I think. And it comes from moja in Japanese, which has those kind of like religious correlations. So let's go to G's show there. Check out our moja. Our mojo. So obviously when you look at in the Japanese to English dictionary, sometimes the definitions can be a little bit lacking or not give you the full context. Fortunately, in this case, we do get some additional stuff to give us a better understanding of what this is. So let's go ahead and check out the details of the kanji, because this one says it is a person who is obsessed. And that is something you don't entirely get from the English, although the fact that they call them hollowing implies that there's like a gap that you want to get filled again. So I think hollowing and hollows is absolutely brilliant as far as like a localization goes, because it can convey that idea without necessarily being directly tied to Buddhism. So it's a little bit of damned if you do, damned if you don't. There's like no good parallel between moja and whatever we have in English. So the first character does mean like the deceased, and then the second one is person. So literally when you break down the characters, it is like a person who's dead or like lost essentially. But because of the way that like kanji are read, there can be more context or like cultural context that just doesn't come across in a very like literal reading of the two characters, because combined they have more meaning than they do alone, which is why we get the whole person who is obsessed and a person with a blind lust for something, which I think is also related to Seath. I believe he's called Moju. I'm not like super familiar with these. Oh no, that's not what I was thinking. Anyway, I need to look at exactly what Seath is called, because even though he is kind of a fierce animal, that's not what I was thinking. Moja. Anyway, I'll go back to the video now.
Dukkha is another fundamental concept of Buddhism. It roughly translates to pain or suffering, and it's positioned as the underpinning of all life. Suffering exists everywhere in our world, from disaster, disease, and death. and not to mention fighting Melania. God damn it, she's hard. I can't. Anyway,
That was a little bit louder than I would have liked. So I did find the word because I looked it up a long time ago. It's not Moju, it's Moshu. So I was close. Where are we at? I'm blind. I am blind. Oh, I guess that's a pun now, huh? Whoa. Why is this so? Okay, there we go. So this describes Seath attachment to a delusional idea, and in Buddhism specifically, attachment to worldly matters. So that's why I think it's really important to show that Seath's attachment is more physical in nature, and his blindness is like a negative thing, as opposed to the very common depiction of blindness being a symbol for somebody who doesn't see the physical world and they see like the spiritual world. This is like the inversion of that trope where they literally can't see the world because their own attachments are getting in the way of their sight. So anyway, can you guys see that?
Dukkha goes.
What is going on? Okay, what did I do? Where is my video? Oh, wait. Did I really do that? Okay. So I think I like accidentally wait, no, that's fine. I think I must have like deleted my Google window somehow. Okay, Control Z. Fixed it. You were all hollow for the shadow of the Erd Tree. Okay.
Hand in hand with another concept, tanha. Tanha means desire, thirst, or craving. The idea is that tanha is one of the main causes of dukkha. Desire leads to suffering. You want that, but you can't have it. You want that PS5, but there are only like 3 in existence, and so on. Even if you get what you want, you'll still want more, and that in turn causes suffering. The ancient dragon from Dark Souls 2 summarizes these concepts very well.
Yet another stands before us. The volume sucks. Then so be it. For the curse of life is the curse of want.
Suffering and the craving that...
So the funny thing is that's all just kind of like a byproduct of the localization and isn't how like the Japanese is. But this is a case where I think like the localization is actually better than the Japanese, believe it or not. Because it does tie life to desire directly, which is hugely thematically important for characters like Nishandra. So you don't necessarily need to use like the dragon to get that understanding of things, because Nishandra is like literally the avatar of want in Dark Souls 2.
Leads to suffering is exemplified by the NPCs you meet throughout your journey. Solaire craves his light and is driven mad searching for it. Sigmair's desire is to become a great champion, and he either ends up dead or disappointed in himself for not living up to those expectations. So far I've described the first 2 of the 4 noble truths of Buddhism. The first being that life is dukkha, or suffering. The second is the cause of suffering being tanha, craving and desire. The third truth is to acknowledge that just like all things are impermanent, so is suffering. Through enlightenment, one can...
And then this will tie back into Wender's video, which we just watched before this. Because there's dukkha, because there's tanha, that is essentially like the prerequisite for life in these games. You need to be able to suffer to live, and the more you suffer, the stronger you become. That's kind of like the core theme of Dark Souls, that you need to struggle for your goals, no matter how trite or tragic the ending may be.
Can end the cycle of suffering and achieve nirvana. I'm not the first one to discuss the parallels between Dark Souls and Buddhism. Many people online have discussed this, and some of the conclusions about Nirvana are very interesting. People call the Age of Dark ending attaining Nirvana, as it could be a means of ending the cycle of life and death caused by the continuation of the first flame. Another take I've seen is that to go hollow is to attain Nirvana, which is also interesting. Many Buddhist teachings suggest that to attain Nirvana is to dispel attachment from all earthly things and desires, which does happen when someone goes hollow, but does this really look like the end of suffering to you? To me, it looks like the opposite. Not to mention, hollows still go through samsara, the endless cycle of death and rebirth, which is supposed.
So there's a little bit more to this. I don't know if he's going to go into the details of it, but I'll just leave this dropped right here to pick up if he doesn't cover it in the hollows who become dragons in Archdragon Peak.
To end when someone achieves nirvana. The fourth noble truth in Buddhism is that to achieve nirvana, one should follow the eightfold path. Essentially, it's to strike a balance with 8 different aspects of life. So, is there any character who has achieved nirvana in Dark Souls? Yes. It was the ancient stone dragons, dude. They were completely neutral in all thought and actions. They were literally just vibing until Gwyn had to come along and fuck it all up. So yeah, I believe the Age of Dark ending is the best ending, as it puts an end to the unnatural cycle of keeping the flame alive, which would in turn end all desires. It's time to reject modernity and embrace tradition, which in this case are giant stone dragons. Thanks for watching.
That was a little abrupt, but no, that was a pretty good video. I'm glad that he mentioned the dragons at the end there, because obviously I think that does have a very big tie into Buddhism, because the way you become a dragon in Dark Souls 3 especially is by meditating under, not a tree, under the circumstances of trying to become one with the dragons, who are constantly believed to be like transcendental beings, or like something along those lines. I don't remember exactly what the game calls them, but a lot of like the Drake Blood Knights believed like the dragon blood would allow them to attain enlightenment. But anyway, the whole idea that one could transcend the cycle of samsara is a strong possibility in Dark Souls, believe it or not, but it just looks maybe a little bit, what's the word? Anticlimactic or uneventful to an outside observer. So I would argue that all of the dudes who turned into like half dragon men in Archdragon Peak, they may have achieved enlightenment, and the way that they did that was through meditation and letting go of their desires. Now, within Dark Souls, if literally desire equals dark, then losing desire equals losing dark. So by these dudes meditating and losing their darkness, they're losing their desire, and they're literally losing their lives because they are transcending the cycle of samsara as it exists within the Dark Souls universe. Now, there is another parallel example of this kind of going right, depending on how you look at it. In Dark Souls 2, as I mentioned before, the Seed of a Tree of Giants says that there are those who like live beyond the cycle. Just where the hell do they go is kind of like the Japanese version of that. So that does tell us that there is something beyond the cycle there. But what does that mean? I think the answer comes from the giants who actually turn into trees. When they turn into trees, they still have their memories for a little bit, but I guess if they get rid of them, they would just kind of turn back into trees. And in Dark Souls 3, when we go on the High Wall of Lothric, we've got a bunch of hollows turning into trees as well. Is the way that they became trees natural and holistic? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they started becoming trees just because they lost all their darkness. It's kind of a terrifying thought to just like be forcefully given enlightenment by loss of identity and loss of self. And that kind of ties back into the whole idea of attachment to life and attachment to self, which is what my last Dark Souls video was about, with Yuria and the Lord of Hollows more or less rejecting the truth of man by desiring to fashion their idea of what man should be into the order of the universe in Dark Souls 3. So, why is this important again? And what does that have to do with like not souls, but emotions and giants and stuff? In Dark Souls 1, Hawkeye Guff is actually carving the little faces by imparting his emotions into them. So if giants can get rid of their emotions, they can presumably become the trees and kind of escape the cycle. So those are some other very like Buddhist things that are present within the Dark Souls games that our friend Noxcast has not mentioned yet. But nonetheless, I do think this is a really good video. I enjoyed it quite a bit. So, all right, how do you have a good night? This is your favorite video of the stream. Is really direct and short and sweet. The dragon gesture is literally called meditation, right? Maybe? I don't remember, to be honest. But I think it's something along those lines, like dragon meditation. You think the giants are the reincarnation of the arch trees? Maybe. And of course, like, there's a very interesting through line of, like, the bones of dragons potentially being composed of souls, depending on how you feel about, like, the Iron Golem core in Dark Souls 1, and Titanite being related to souls and all that stuff. So, anyway, that was a really good video. I'm going to go ahead and link it into the chat if you guys want to give Noxcast a like and or a sub. I'm going to go ahead and sub myself. I guess I just did that. And all right, that'll pretty much be it for me for the stream. Tomorrow we will continue with a couple more videos. I might start off with Moxie Watts' video about how we got bamboozled by Grand Sax, but I'll need to like look through the extended list and shuffle things to kind of fit our timeline for each night. So we've only went a few minutes over time, which is nice. So now I'll be able to get to bed a little bit earlier. So that'll be it for me. Hopefully we will catch you guys on the next stream. Stay safe, take care. Last Protagonist out.